When we are divided, we needlessly lose hundreds of thousands to a preventable global pandemic. Divided, we destroy our planet and fail to slow climate change. Divided, we put millions in the path of war, poverty, and injustice. Divided, we lose trust in each other. But when we come together, we can collaborate to solve our biggest global crises. Together, we can protect the planet for our children. Together, we can build a better future for everyone. Together, we can share our one world in peace. At this time of great need, we need each other now more than ever. Let's come together at One Shared World.
Welcome to Rise or Fall Together, the OneShared.World Interdependence Summit. I'm Jamie Metzl. If it feels like our world is coming apart amidst the deadliest pandemic in a century, the worst climate change-induced disasters in millennia, and hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people falling into abject poverty, we can't despair because there's hope. That hope is you. It's all of us from all around the world and millions more who will join us coming together. The SARS-CoV-2 virus didn't alone break our world. It just capitalized on what was already broken. A world where billions lived in fear they would not be able to support, feed, or educate their families. We drove our ecosystem to the verge of collapse, and where systemic injustice, racism, and poverty remained unaddressed. When the virus exploited these collective failures, we were all harmed as a result. The pandemic is a wake-up call. The question for all of us is whether we will wake up. Our world faced a moment very similar to this a little over 100 years ago in 1918. A period of intense globalization in the early 20th century had been followed by the devastating First World War. After the armistice, two visions competed for the future. One was a path of inclusion and coming together in a league of people and nations. The other was a path of vilification, extreme nationalism, and wall building. The second group eventually emerged victorious, which brought us another world war and 85 million unnecessary deaths. Similarly, today, we have two different paths before us, a path of inclusion or a path of exclusion. A path of coming together, or a path of continuing to fall apart. We are here today to fight for the better option, the future we all want to build. Because if our experience of the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that we're all part of an interconnected world where both our strengths and our vulnerabilities are shared. If the virus spreads and mutates among the most vulnerable populations, we are all weaker as a result. We rise or fall together. That was our essential realization in the early days of the pandemic. If we solve COVID-19 without addressing the broader challenge of pandemics, our victory would be Pyrrhic. If we found a way to address pandemic without solving climate change, ecosystem destruction, systemic poverty, racism, and inequality, and so many other challenges, we would be jumping out of the frying pan and continually back into the fire. While we must address each of these challenges individually, we must also build a global system, making it possible for all of them to be addressed collectively. The terrible mismatch we see today between the global nature of our greatest challenges and the predominantly national way we have organized ourselves to address them is an essential problem we must together overcome. In so many areas, the narrow interests of our specific nations or groups overpower our collective needs as members of one species sharing the same planet. We meet today just as the United Nations General Assembly is opening to celebrate its 75th year. There is much to celebrate about the United Nations, but we must also recognize that the United Nations ideal, as envisioned by its founders, has not been realized. Our national political leaders have failed to protect us, not because they haven't done their jobs, but because they've done exactly the jobs we've hired them to do. We can't and should not seek to replace the countries we love or essential institutions like the United Nations. But we must push hard to inspire them to do things differently, to address our greatest common challenges. Because the core problem we face is systemic, our response must also be systemic. In very short order, we humans have gone from being disparate bands of roving nomads to becoming a global species with the awesome technological power to remake almost every aspect of life on Earth. But we have yet to develop a global consciousness or politics to match that power. To safeguard our future, we now need to upgrade our global operating system. We need to build a new framework for how we work together to solve our greatest common challenges based on the mutual responsibilities of our interdependence. That is what One Shared World and this summit are all about. We seek to build an empowered and fully inclusive global interdependence movement of people all around the world, like you, demanding a relevant seat at the table in decision-making for our common humanity. In the 1940s, we had leaders like Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Mahatma Gandhi to guide and inspire us. In the absence of those types of leaders today, we have to divide up among ourselves the job of building that better future, or face the consequences of our inaction. This Action Summit is an effort to do exactly that. You'll soon hear from some of the world's most inspiring people, ranging from political and spiritual leaders to students fighting to save our world and refugees seeing light where so many others see darkness. You'll experience performances from some of the world's greatest artists. But just like you can't hear His Holiness the Dalai Lama teach, or Renee Fleming sing, as you soon will, without those experiences touching your soul, we hope you cannot join this conversation about what is so broken in our world and how we must all come together to fix it without feeling a deep call to action. We don't just need you to spread the word on social media or sign up for our various campaigns. We need you to roll up your sleeves and work with us and with others to make sure that every one of our countries, companies, faith communities, and other organizations and institutions recognize the mutual responsibilities of our interdependence as the foundation of a new global operating system. We must connect our actions on an individual level with our efforts to transform massive global systems. The idea is audacious, but it's even more necessary. No one, unfortunately, is coming to save us and our world. But using the new tools of global connectivity, by joining with open hearts and open minds and the courage of our convictions, we can finally and together build our one shared world for the benefit of each and all of us. We have an absolutely incredible day planned for you today, so I hope everybody will hold on to your chairs and get comfortable. We have 44 speakers and presenters over the next few hours. We have 3,000 registered participants joining in from 70 countries around the world. This isn't just some academic conference that we're putting online. This is a fully virtual event where your involvement, your engagement are essential to everything that we're doing. So we need you to stay involved. We have active social feeds. We want to hear from you. At the end of the day, we're going to have open discussion forums where you'll all be able to meet and discuss and debate together, because we are building this future from the ground up together. And because doing that requires expanding our consciousness, it's my pleasure to invite Native American poet Joan Navayuk Kane to provide our opening invocation.
Mga itira Navayuk, awiva miurunga, slikaya miurunga. I am called for my namesake, Navayuk. I want to acknowledge and honor and summon my ancestors out of respect for our ancestors and future generations. out of gratitude for their stewardship of the land, ice, and sea, and as a reminder that we're all connected, I ask for our ancestors to help us today. I'll read one poem, Unachtarit, which is people related through common possession of territory. The enemy misled that missed the island in the fog. I believe in one or the other, but both exist now to confuse me. Dark from dark, snow from snow. I believe in one craggy boundary, knife blade at the throat's slight swell. From time to time, the sound of voices as through sun-singed grass, or grasses that we use to insulate the walls of our winter houses, walrus hides lashed together with rawhide cords. So warm within the willows and gathered, forced into leaf. I am named for your sister, Navayuk, call me Asong. Surely there are ghosts here, my children sprung from these deeper furrows. The sky of my mind against which self-betrayal in its sudden burn fails to describe the world. We who denied the landscape and saw the light of it. Leaning against the stone wall, ragged, I began to accept my past, and as I accepted it, I felt, and I didn't understand. I am bound to everyone. Ilihanamik, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. Thank you so much, Jane. That was just beautiful, and it reminds us of why we're here, what we're fighting for, a world where everybody's voice can be heard, and we can all come together to solve our greatest problems on the biggest scale and the smallest scale, and it's all connected. As I said, we have an incredible day planned with so many amazing activities, so you'll soon, over the course of the next bit, hear from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, from Renee Fleming, but lots to happen in between. We are engaging and raising all of these issues to keep everybody engaged and involved so we can build together, we can work together, we can fight together. As I mentioned a moment ago, the World Health Organization and the UN system is in a very difficult position these days as people fight, as we all fight to save our world from this deadly pandemic. Any of you who have read the papers or seen the news have seen how difficult it is for organizations like the WHO to navigate this world of states where big powers are competing in ways that are often harming so many of us. And that's why we today need an empowered World Health Organization more than ever. If we didn't have that kind of institution, we would have to build it. And that's why it's so important to have leaders like the person I'm about to introduce, who are working not just to navigate big power politics, but to make sure that institutions like the World Health Organization and treatments and cures and preventive medicines and vaccines can be distributed and resourced to the world's most vulnerable population. Dr. Tedros Adhanom is a great leader and a great friend, and I welcome him to the OneShared.World Interdependence Summit.
Dear Jamie, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. COVID-19 has changed the world we live in. Lives and livelihoods, societies and economies have been lost or disrupted. The effects will be felt for a long time to come. The pandemic has also demonstrated just how small our world is. For all the technological, economic, and military might of nations, this microscopic virus has humbled us all. We have been reminded that in our global village, viruses don't need visas. We can only confront this shared threat with a common approach built on humility and solidarity. The virus thrives on division, but united we can defeat it. The pandemic has also shone a bright light on the delicate relationship between people and planet, a relationship that must be nurtured through a One Health approach that recognizes human health is intimately connected to the health of animals and our shared environment. We're learning the hard way that neglecting or abusing the health of our planet has severe consequences for human health. Ironically, the pandemic has given us a glimpse of our world as it could be. Our air and water can be cleaner. Our streets can be quieter and safer. And many of us have found new ways to work while spending more time with our families. Building back better must mean building back greener. W.H.O has launched its own Green Manifesto for a green and healthy recovery from COVID-19 with 6 simple prescriptions. First, protect nature, which is the source of the air, water, and food on which human health depends. Second, ensure that homes and health facilities have water and sanitation, access to clean and reliable energy, and are resilient to climate change. Third, invest in a quick transition to clean energy that will cut air pollution, so that when COVID-19 has been defeated, people can breathe clean air. Fourth, promote healthy and sustainable food systems to give people access to nutritious and affordable quality food. Fifth, build cities that integrate health into all aspects of urban planning, from sustainable transport systems to healthy housing. And sixth, stop subsidizing fossil fuels that cause pollution and drive climate change. To make this manifesto a reality, we need you. Civil society must be champions for the green, healthy, and prosperous communities and world we need for the future. There is widespread public support for policies that do not seek only to maximize GDP, but to protect our health and planet. I know from my own time in politics that when the people speak with one voice, governments listen. So I urge you, use your voices, use your votes, use your spending habits to demand the world you want, to demand the change you want. Going back to normal is not good enough. The pandemic has reminded us of a simple truth, that for all our differences, we're one human race and we're stronger together. We speak different languages, but we share the same DNA. We adhere to different phases, but we share the same hopes, dreams, and fears. We have different cultures and traditions, but we share the same planet. We all have our own stories, but we share the same destiny. For everything COVID-19 has taken from us, it has also given us something, a reminder of what really matters, and the opportunity to forge a common future. I thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Omar Sana. I am a co-leader of the coordination program here at OneShared.World and the founder of Invenium Consulting. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the stage somebody we're very happy to have with us, Kehkashan Basu, who is the founder and president of the Green Hope Foundation and is a UN human rights champion.
Our common vision. These are the starting words of the Rio Declaration on the Future We Want document that formed the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals. 8 long years have elapsed since the Rio Declaration adoption, yet we have completely ignored the need and importance of implementing this common vision. Instead, polarization, isolationism, and national chauvinism continue to make our nations and societies increasingly insular. And then this pandemic struck, catching all nations, including the mightiest, off guard, sending each country diving into its own cubbyhole, closing borders, and in a sense replicating the proverbial ostrich, as if burying our heads would avert the problem. And as with all disasters, its effect has been disproportionate, with a magnified impact on the LDCs and on the vulnerable sections of civil society, amongst them young people and women. The irony of the situation lies in the fact that for 5 years we have had a mechanism in the SDGs, a detailed set of 17 goals and 169 targets that address and suggest action pathways to address the issues that beget our planet and humanity. Yet we allowed the same trend of overconsumption and wastage to continue that made rich nations richer while the poor sunk deeper into the abyss. Our inaction will compound the pandemic effect and consequently the quality of the world future generations will inherit. Now more than ever before, the onus is on us, young people. Remember, we are the largest constituent of civil society. Don't get misled by promises that we are the future leaders. That is just one more way of keeping us away from the decision-making table. We are today's leaders who should be deciding what our future should look like. That has been my mission for the last 12 years, and through Green Hope, we empower the world's most vulnerable, those whom the world has forgotten, refugees, children of prisoners, indigenous communities, supporting them with skills-based education so that they can take tangible actions in making their local communities equitable and sustainable. I firmly believe that we are better and more capable than just leading protests and shouting slogans. Young people must stop allowing themselves to be exploited, being used in this tokenistic fashion. It is time each one of us took accountability and took ground-level actions accordingly. Multilateralism must be the new mantra as we come out of the pandemic pause. Collaboration, cooperation, and empathy must be our drivers. Our outreach must address the needs of those who are the farthest first. We need to implement local circular economies and stop the current linear supply chain mechanism that takes away the natural resources of developing nations to feed Western consumers, leaving them to grapple with a degraded environment. And this change must be driven by us, the youth, the leaders of today, who must decide what tomorrow should look like. Thank you.
So welcome back, everybody, and welcome to the Driving Change Voices for the Next Generation panel. It's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. In addition to Kekishan Basu, who you just almost heard from, we have Mateo Gomez joining us, who's the Director of Administration and Events here at OneShared.World and is a student at Dalhousie University. Arnav Jain is a student at Kriya University, a co-director of Global Administration here at OneShared.World, and also the founder and CEO of MoCA. We have Shagun Sethi, who's a consultant at Grant Thornton and also a co-leader of the coordination program here at OneShared.World. As you know, I'm Omer Sana, a fellow co-leader of the coordination program and the founder of Invenium Consulting. Thank you very much for joining me, everybody, and let's get straight to the discussion. Arnav, I'd like to start with you and ask you a question about bridging the gap. I think we all understand, if we zoom all the way out, that it's important to articulate what it is that the voices of the next generation are truly saying. We've seen contrasting views in how people envision the world sometimes fall along generational lines. So in order to help listeners who out there who might not know what we mean, what exactly is the change that the youth are driving for?
Namaste, everyone, and thank you, Omar, for that question. I think that there's a perception that the youth is anti-hierarchical, which in my opinion isn't the case. It's more of a matter of being pro-collaboration. I know when I say collaboration, I don't just mean dividing the work and meeting to compile it like we do right now while working from home. But on a more serious note, we aren't against structure. It's more about working together and exploring our creative synergies. We've seen that strict adherence to existing structures isn't a remedy to many of the challenges that we face today. I think what the youth are advocating for is a willingness to revisit the structures and change them when need be. In other words, we believe in collaborative growth, meritocracy, and getting the right person for the job, rather than ranking them based on their gender, age, background, or institution that they've been nurtured in. Another thing to better answer this question is that humanity today undoubtedly benefits from a high level of information availability. It's a lot harder to ignore hardships and injustice taking place halfway across the world when you wake up to images, audio, and commentary in the palm of your hands on a daily basis. I know it's a cliche when I say this, but with knowledge comes responsibility. I don't think we're more socially conscious than prior generations, but I do think we're better informed. What's interesting is that I think that information touches on two very different aspects of humanity. The constant stories about hardships draws over our empathetic side, while the constant access to groundbreaking science evokes our logical side. Drawing on both effectively and in balance makes the youth a highly effective tool for change. I would just like to conclude by saying yes, we across generations might have our differences, but it's more important now than ever before to be interdependent, and not just amongst each other, but also with our surroundings. We have depended on a habitat for centuries now. I think it's time that we let our habitat depend on us. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you so much, Arnav. That was a very helpful response, and I think some very important context on the perspective that the youth are trying to offer. Moving on, I'd like to talk about reversing the trend. This one's for you, Matteo. Throughout history, we've seen, particularly from the 1900s onwards, that as globalization has become more of a factor, global temperament has shifted back and forth between periods of more and less isolation. With protectionism and isolationism on the rise, what role do young people play in reversing these trends?
Thank you, Omar. It's a pleasure to be here. The role that young people play in reversing the trend in isolationism is based on having a new perspective of the world and putting pressure on those with the power to create the necessary change in order to resolve threats like climate change, pandemics, inequality, and poverty. The trends of isolationism and protectionism, in my opinion, are caused by selfishness, apathy, and fear by states only caring about their own issues, not caring about the issues that others around the world are facing, and being afraid of change that tackling these issues could create going forward. Similar to the point that Arnav made when answering his last question, the world is more interconnected and interwoven than ever. And with that interconnectivity comes access to information and ease of communication between people groups. And with that new access to information and ease of communication comes empathy. When you see images of wildfires, rising sea levels, and the melting of ice shelves on both of our poles, when you are reminded of a global pandemic that has impacted everyone on Earth, when you hear stories of systemic, generational poverty and inequality throughout the world, it is more and more difficult to turn a blind eye. The reason that young people today are uniquely situated to reverse these trends is because we have access to this new technology and to this information, which gives us a new perspective of the world. This perspective forces us to care about global issues, and over time, as more and more people gain this new perspective, the higher the incentive governments, states, and those in power will have to address these global issues. And in doing so, work together as more of a global community instead of only working on their own. By pushing those in power to create resolutions to these global threats, young people are working to prevent the rise of isolationism and promoting global cooperation and interdependence. Thanks, Omar.
Thanks so much, Matteo. It's very interesting to see that it seems that this theme of access to information seems to be a prevalent talking point here. And I'm inclined to agree. I think access to information does evoke a level of empathy and logic and information that we otherwise wouldn't have had access to in previous generations. Moving forward, Shagan, I'd like to talk to you about the multi-stakeholder model, and in particular, the role that nonprofits have in this. In an ideal circumstance, our national leaders would do what we elect them to do, which is to say that they would look after the best interests of their nation. Similarly, international agencies like the UN are built on that same concept of interdependence and cooperation that OneShared.World advocates, and they too are tasked to do what they were created for, which is to look after international cooperation. So when we have leaders addressing national issues and we have international organizations addressing international issues, what role does a nonprofit have to play in all of this, and why exactly is it so important that there's a third pillar to this system?
Thank you so much for your question, Omar. It's great to be here. And while I answer this question, I would love if you could all think with me. The different actors and the different systems that form our world and make sure that we continue progressing are the ones that also define who fall in this system. They're also the ones that create definitions of what a nation means and who comes under that nation, who comes under this development paradigm of these international organizations. And while those definitions, I believe, are super important to guide us and take us forth, it's also important to think about who these definitions exclude. And where are the voices of these people who have been systematically excluded? I argue that this is exactly where the nonprofits step up. The nonprofit world essentially provides voice to those who have been silenced by oppression. And this oppression includes patriarchy. This oppression includes racism. This oppression includes casteism. And so it is very important to see these nonprofits not as systems in opposition to existing nations or existing international organizations like the UN. However, we should see them as organizations that bolster and constantly support these systems. They go ahead and put pressure on these systems to perform better and include those who have been excluded, maybe by mistake or maybe by fault of structure. I believe that that is also the reason why a lot of us young people are in love with nonprofits. If you look around you, you see so many young people going ahead and volunteering, going ahead and participating in all of these different activities to make this world a better place. And I think that is because these nonprofits do not represent nations. They don't represent our static identities that we're born into. They instead go ahead and represent a global. They represent the in-betweens of these boundaries, the in-betweens of identities, and provide voice to those who are voiceless. I think that's the reason why it's very important to see nonprofits as a checks and balance system, rather than a system that goes ahead and pushes things away. It's important to change the way we look at these organizations and give them a space at the table to go ahead and participate in decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shagun. There was some great insight there, and you've touched on some very important topics, particularly diversity, inclusivity, and systemic obstacles. So thank you very much for that response, Shagun. We'd like to move on to a rapid-fire question that I'd like to pose to all the panelists. And this is sort of what I like to call the magic wand scenario. If you did indeed have a magic wand and you were able to wave it and initiate any one change in the global system in the interest of greater cooperation and better recognition of interdependence, what would that change be? So just going across the panel, Arnav, would you like to start?
Sure thing. Thanks for the question, Omar, and that's an interesting one. I think we should stop spending on defense and reinvest all of that money into rehabilitating our surroundings and ourselves.
Great. Thank you so much, Arnav. Matteo?
Access to knowledge and education so that everyone around the world can be aware of global issues and the world around us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Shagun?
I think we need a lot more people who represent people from vulnerable communities. I would love to have more women on the table while taking decisions. Today, we don't have those. And so we need people like Kehkashan, who's on our panel today, to be a part of such decision-making processes.
Awesome. Thank you, Shagun. Kehkashan?
I think we need a change in attitude of people that it's someone else's problem, and we really need to see it as our problem, and only then can we bring about change.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Kehkashan, now that we have you back, I would like to follow up and ask you a slightly more detailed question if we have the time. I'd like to talk to you about the urgency of some of the issues that we're facing right now. As you know, a lot of timelines have been established for this by various coalitions. We have landmark initiatives like the UN SDGs, which have goals that they've set by 2030. There's massive movements for decarbonization by 2050. So can you talk about the urgency of these issues, some of the timelines that have been set out, and why those may contrast with the timelines that we need?
Absolutely. Yeah, these dates are extremely important milestones, and I think that they have a distinct impact on the fate of humankind and indeed the future health and prosperity of our planet. And these target dates are based on the scientific iterations derived from predictive models based on planetary data. And it's really imperative that we do not breach these thresholds, because non-compliance would mean that we would lose the battle against global hunger, poverty alleviation, global warming, peace, gender parity, social equity, and all the aspects that are integral in creating a just and equitable world. And substantial progress had been made on many of the 17 goals and 169 targets in the last 5 years. But then COVID struck, and our biggest concern now is the detrimental impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, as it has wiped out much of this progress in many crucial sectors, such as in poverty and global hunger and on vulnerable communities. And it's really critical to assess the quantum of this damage, and the process of building back better must incorporate these time-bound mechanisms to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs so that we are able to achieve Agenda 2030. And the world really cannot afford any procrastination in this regard. And that's basically been my mission for the last 12 years through Green Hope Foundation, to empower those who the world has forgotten, from refugees to children on the streets, the destitute, and making sure that through education for sustainable development, every single person is involved in this process. So right now, it's really time for us to implement the Rio agenda on which the SDGs is based in letter and in spirit. And multilateralism is the call of the day. And collaboration, cooperation, empathy must be our drivers. And as Shogun just mentioned, it's so critical that we involve the marginalized and the vulnerable communities and involve the farthest first, and only then can we take the step towards a sustainable world. And that change must be driven by us, the young people, the leaders of not tomorrow, but the leaders of today, who must decide what tomorrow looks like.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that response, Keikishan. I think you've given us all a lot more to think about, and I can't help but agree wholeheartedly. I think if we can take from this lessons like trusting science and trying to build back better, those are good takeaways to have. With that, I'd like to thank all of my panelists. Thank you so very much, Matteo, Shogun, Arnav, and Keikishan. It's been an absolute pleasure, and this has been the Voices of the Next Generation panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omar and panel. That was just incredible and so inspiring. For all of us, and especially those of us who are of an older generation, there was a time not too long ago where many of us looked at some younger people and watched what was happening on social media, a bunch of people posting images of lasagna, and felt, well, there's got to be something more. And one of the incredible things that this pandemic and Black Lives Matter and climate crisis and so many other things have done is to bring these incredibly young leaders to the fore, who are now leading all of us and demanding change, demanding that we all work together to build a better future for everyone. And that's why that conversation is just so important. I love what we heard about an attitudinal change. I said in my opening remarks, we now need to recognize that in our world, we can't sit back and wait for others or leaders to save us, to change the world. We all have to do the job ourselves. And that, I think, is the message, not just of this younger generation, but of all of us. There's a certain helplessness we all feel watching the pandemic, watching these fires rage in the Western United States, in Australia, and so many other places. Seeing people in the most vulnerable parts of the world, places like Bangladesh and some of the Pacific Islands, who are suffering terribly as a result of climate change. But we can't allow ourselves to sink into that kind of powerlessness, because just as the problems have been made by us and past generations, the solutions also can and must come from us. That's the key of what we're doing here. In the early days of One Shared World, we saw so many young people, like some of whom you've just seen, flock to our mission to build our global interdependence movement. And the reason why we're all working together is because talking about building that better world is not abstract. It has to be real. It has to be realized in improving the lives of the most vulnerable among us. It has to be realized in solving problems. In the next block of our conversation today, we're going to look at 3 big global challenges and how we can think differently about addressing them using the context of interdependence: pandemics, climate change, and global systemic poverty and inequality. We know what's happening with our pandemic crisis, but what we don't really appreciate is that the next pandemic could be even worse. And that's why it's such an honor for me to, in a moment, introduce our next speaker. David Nabarro is the World Health Organization COVID-19 coordinator and has been a champion of making sure that the needs of the world's most vulnerable populations have been addressed for many, many decades. After David speaks, we're going to have a dialogue with some incredible people. Naveen Rao, Senior Vice President for Health at the Rockefeller Foundation, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, the founder and chair of Biocon, and Dean Michelle Williams, the Dean of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It's now my great pleasure to introduce David Nabarro.
Thank you very much indeed. Jamie is an inspirational guy and has really had an enormous influence on my thinking recently. And so I'm really proud to be here and to be given this space. You heard that I'm working on the new coronavirus, the one that causes the disease COVID-19. And I'm doing this together with the World Health Organization. So you won't be surprised if I'm going to be focusing on that for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk about the relationship between humanity and the new virus, talking about it in quite an intimate way. I'm going to address the virus and help you to understand how I see this virus. And then I'm going to look ahead to how humans can get ahead of the pandemic by organizing themselves to be able to defend against the virus. And so the second part will be on how we humans can get ahead. And then I'm going to say how well I think we are doing. I'm going to give us a report card, and both on how we're doing now, how we're going to be doing perhaps in 6 months' time. And I'm going to look ahead to the prospect that we'll be having more of these kinds of viruses and ask, how well are we going to be able to do? I'm going to try to do all that in 6 minutes. Of course, there's a chance that I will leave you scratching your heads saying, hey, he has not answered all my questions. Well, there will be space because there's going to be a panel and question and answer, but also do stay in touch with me. I'm accessible on LinkedIn. You can find my email on the internet. Because I really want to continue the conversation and I look forward to being able to do that. I think what we're talking about here is so important for our collective future. So what is the relationship between humanity and the new coronavirus? Well, viruses appear. Don't let anybody tell you that this is an unexpected or weird thing. We've been saying for a long time that there's going to be pandemics coming that cause problems. We, in fact, don't even call them pandemics. We say they're going to be outbreaks caused by emerging pathogens. 75% of them will come from the animal kingdom. Most of them will come and appear in a small part of the world and will fizzle out. We may not even notice them. Very occasionally they come and they stick and they cause problems. And we do have influenza pandemics from time to time. Very, very occasionally they come along and cause a major problem. And we have one of those now. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, says this is a once-in-a-century event. And don't let anybody tell you it's a trivial event. Please don't. If they do, say to them, sorry, this is really deadly serious. Of course, the virus does not kill everybody it infects. And in fact, the number of people who are killed when they get infected is quite small. It's about 1%, possibly less. But the point is that 1%, if we've got a virus that's very easily transmitted amongst lots of people, is an awful lot of people. We're well up to 900,000 people dead as a result of this pandemic. Probably the number is much, much greater because we don't go around and count everybody. So we've already got more than 1 million people, I believe, dead, and the number will go on increasing. Because the other feature about this virus is it's sticking around. It's not going to disappear. I know lots of people would love it to disappear, and they keep saying it's going to disappear. But you can't wish viruses away. They're very, very single-minded. They just exist to multiply. This virus, I believe, is going to stick around. Coronaviruses are pretty stable. Humanity is actually coming to terms with it and is working out how to live with this virus. But it's tough because poorer people everywhere get it the worst. Whether they're people living in very densely crowded living conditions, people working in factories or other locations where they're very packed together. Perhaps they're in a crew on a ship, perhaps they're in the detention center or in a prison, or perhaps they're in a residential center for older people, perhaps they're in a hospital where there's a lot of cases. You know, these are places where people are really likely to get infected. And if they're poor, it's tough. So humanity and this new coronavirus, I'd say at the moment, the coronavirus has got the upper hand. Humanity learned that it could stop the spread of this coronavirus by suddenly reducing movement so that people couldn't transmit it to each other. And all over Europe, we had a lot of countries going into lockdown. In fact, there was one point in about 2.5 months ago when half the world was living in lockdown. But you can't go on with that situation. Lockdown is terrible for poor people. And so what we've got to do is to learn as humanity to live with this virus as a constant threat without it making life, particularly for poor people, really untenable, without it increasing poverty, increasing malnutrition, increasing suffering. And that's the tough job. So the relationship between humanity and the new coronavirus, I would say we're working out how to be COVID ready in all sorts of different settings. Next point is, can we humans get ahead of it? Yes, we can. We know how to interrupt transmission, deal with outbreaks, suppress them quickly, but we got to get organized. People everywhere have to know what they've got to do. Local communities have to be integrated and respond, and governments have to create public health services that work. It can be done. Just look at what's happening in parts of Africa. Look at South Africa. It's not a totally difficult situation. There have been some real progress. Parts of India, there's been extraordinary progress, including in some of the slums. Ditto in Latin America. There's been amazing progress throughout many parts of the world. In fact, looking right across Europe, some countries have done really, really well. Humans can get ahead. We've just got to make sure they do. And that means consistent leadership. It means people having the right narrative. It means governments cooperating. It means particularly ensuring that there's not politicization. So we humans can get ahead. We must get ahead. We will get ahead. But last point, how well are we going to do in the coming weeks and months? Well, right now the situation is bad. There is a disease that's advancing, that's killing 1% of the people infected. It's killing lots of health workers. And actually the people who survive, about 1 in 20 of them have got a nasty illness called long COVID. So we must get better organized. Otherwise, in the next 6 to 12 months, the virus will beat us. But if we beat this virus, which I believe we will, we have it in ourselves. We see examples from all over the world, particularly in East Asia, of communities beating it. Then we're going to have a most amazing sense of self-confidence. We humans have shown that by working together, we can tackle an existential threat. Well, let's do the same for persistent inequity. Let's do the same for the destruction of nature. Let's do the same for climate change. It's like the virus is giving us a test to demonstrate what we're able to do through interdependence, and then to get on top of other things. And I hear countless people who are perhaps a third or a half of my age saying, what are we waiting for? What on earth are we waiting for? Why on earth don't we pool our skills and work together to get ahead of this virus and to make sure that life can go on? And by the way, while we're doing it, let's deal with the inequities that really are making poor people so much poorer as a result of this disease. Thank you for the chance to say these words.
That was really great, David. As usual, you've set the stage for us. My name is Naveen Rao. I'm the Senior Vice President at Rockefeller Foundation. It's an honor to be here, share the panel with such distinguished fellows, actually friends, all three personal, and I look forward to this conversation. In fact, I'm itching to get started and move out of the way, but before I do that, I just wanted to set the stage. Basically, what we are going to discuss today for the next 14 minutes is what can we do differently? As David has said, the viruses have been here long before we as humans came on this planet, and they probably will be there forever. They are doing exactly what we are doing, trying to survive. We cannot fault them for that. They are busily going about how to get stronger and better and to survive in this world. So they will be around. There will be other pandemics. We are not going to get a pass because we had one this year. In which case, what can we do differently, and how do we make sure we learn from what has happened, and how can we come back and be better prepared for the future? So I have a distinguished panel. I'm going to briefly introduce them and then move on to the questions. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw is an Indian billionaire entrepreneur. She's the chairperson and managing director of Biocon Limited, a biotechnology company based in Bangalore. She is the former chairperson of the Indian Institute of Management, and she was awarded the Othmer Gold Medal for outstanding contribution to the progress of science. She's on Financial Times top 50 women in business list, and she is listed as the 65th most powerful woman in the world by Forbes. Wow. So Kiran, welcome. It's been a long time since we've connected. It's a pleasure to see you. Michelle Williams is the Dean of the Faculty of Harvard's Chan School of Public Health, and Angelopoulos Professor in Public Health and International Development, and which is a joint faculty appointment at the Harvard Chan School and the Harvard Kennedy School. She is internationally renowned epidemiologist and a public health scientist, an award-winning educator, and widely recognized as an academic leader. She has won multiple awards. The one that impressed me is the one that says the White House Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering. And David Nabarro, who's spoken to us, is a medical director who's made his career in the international civil service, working for either the Secretary General of the United Nations or the Director General of the World Health Organization. Most recently, from February 2020, he has helped the Director General at WHO deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Amongst the list of awards, I was most impressed with the one that says CBE, which I believe is meant to be Commander of the British Empire, which he was awarded in 1992. So,
terrible title. I'm not so great.
So there is no doubt we have the right people on the panel. Let me start with you, Dr. Williams. As David has said, this pandemic has exposed inequities in all aspects. As David has outlined, it is the poor and the vulnerable who have been affected the most and will be affected the most. So the question to you is, specifically, can you provide us some more clarity on how we should address these inequities, and how should we all stand to win by helping the most vulnerable? What can we do differently, very specifically?
Yeah, thank you so much. And David, congratulations. That was really a lovely opening for this session. I really appreciated your remarks. Dean, I think this pandemic, which coincided with the very obvious and very stark loss of life of George Floyd, created an environment where many of us had to come to terms with the fact that we still have to reckon with the biological convulsion as a consequence of the pandemic, the economic convulsion as a consequence of the pandemic, and then also the societal issues around racism and inequality, particularly in the United States. These convulsions happening at the same time has forced a reckoning of the inequity, but also a reckoning of the challenges we face in not having a public health leadership, system, infrastructure, and workforce sufficiently prepared to manage man-made and natural disasters and crises like a pandemic. So I want to say that this pandemic has forced a reckoning on two fronts. One, that public health matters and preparedness and response and investment in that matters. And secondly, we have to confront systemic racism and inequality nationally and globally. The question is a very important one, because rather than dwell on where the mistakes and gaps are, we have to look forward to how do we prevent this from happening again, where we fall short in responding to crises. And I would say the first way forward is to remember the most important thing about the importance of public health. That is, public health is a science-driven, evidence-based response to preventing, promoting, and preserving health during peacetime as well as during times of crisis. So the first thing I would say for how to move forward and to be prepared is have science lead the way. The second thing I would say is public health and global public health requires an appropriate investment in proportion to the size, the scope, and the primacy of investing in the core fundamental societal undergirding of our national security, our global security, and our global economic health. So recognize the importance and the primacy of public health and global health, and make the investments that are necessary. In the United States, of all the funds that we spend on health and healthcare, only 2.5% is invested in public health. The estimates are we need at least $4.5 billion in public health in this country, in the United States alone, to provide the adequate level of protection, prevention, and care and wellness for a population. So investment matters. And when the funds are made available, the investment has to be strategic. We have to think about building resilient, sustainable, adaptable public health, global health systems that can respond to climate change disasters, that can respond to the gaps in human resources, that can close gaps that are persistent, such as the digital technology divide, which is ever more important as we need to have 21st century informatics systems to help us do the surveillance necessary for threats, but also the surveillance necessary for evaluating the interventions that are put in place. We have to reckon with the inequities that exist and do everything necessary to close those inequity gaps. You know, the disproportionate burden of COVID on poor and Black and brown communities is not new. 100 years ago, when the world had to experience the 1918 influenza, Black and brown people in the United States were disproportionately impacted. We have to do better. We can do better if we address the inequities that exist nationally and globally. I'd say the other thing is, when we think about interventions, we should not be thinking in a categorical, siloed way, but rather take a more systematic approach to addressing the many social determinants of health. Many of us already know this, that 80 to 90% of the factors that promote and preserve health are way upstream from the healthcare system. They are in the ecosystem, the places where we live, work, play, and learn. And that means we have to deploy place-based interventions that address the many social determinants of health, that address the issues of lack of green space, that address the issues of food insecurity, housing insecurity, and inaccessible economic opportunities for generating a livable wage and creating wealth in communities. And let me just say that we also have to reinvest and build back our public health institutions. We have to put science back in the driving seat. We have to support our FDA and our CDC, build back better so that these authoritative and science-driven organizations can have the opportunity to collect, disseminate, and communicate the important public health messages for all.
So, Michelle, that was really excellent. You've hit all the points. I had so many questions for you, but it's amazing how within the span you were able to hit all of them. But it's a great segue. I'd like to move to Dr. Mazumdar-Shaw. Kiran, we've been talking about public-private partnerships now. It was the topic of choice for the last decade. Everyone said you can't do this alone. You need the public sector and the private sector, and you represent the private sector. And I know how your sentiments lie with public health. So what can we do differently? Specifically, I'm asking the same question I asked Michelle is, how can we be better prepared for the future? What can we do differently when it comes to public-private partnerships?
So first and foremost, Naveen, it's great to see you after a very long time, and it's great to be on this panel. Let me start by saying that actually this pandemic has created a very new collaborative ecosystem because we're all in it together. We have all suddenly realized that this pandemic knows no borders. It has basically shown us that we are a very interconnected world, and we have to have this collective effort to overcome the virus. So what really gives me a lot of comfort is that the whole process of vaccine development, the whole approach to basically developing new treatments, new protocols, this has been a very collective effort where private sector, the public sector, and governments all over the world have somehow come together on a common platform to see how do we, get these vaccines in an equitable way to people across the world who will actually need them and get their livelihoods back on track. So the way I look at it is we've never seen this kind of collective effort to develop vaccines. I mean, today you have over 100 vaccine programs under development. You've got many, of these vaccine programs that have been partnered between small biotechs or small research groups and big pharma. You've got governments, supporting them with a huge amount of public funding. Taxpayers' monies have been used, and so on and so forth. And today, everyone's eyes are on these top 6 vaccines that are progressing. And of course, there is this politics is getting ahead of science, and that should never happen. I think collectively, I'm glad to see that, the companies involved in vaccine development took that pledge to see that, to say that they would not, release an unsafe vaccine for public use. So I think there's been a lot of collaboration, a lot of collective thinking. But if I was to look at one good thing that we could also think about in terms of, the better pandemic preparedness, I really think I go back to what Michelle said, what David said. I think we need to strengthen our public health system. I know that in India, we have a lot of inequities. You know it as well as I do, Naveen, that, the out-of-pocket spends that, the poor and the rural folk have to sort of incur drives them into poverty. And I think this time around, we have seen that in the early stages of this pandemic, it was the community efforts that actually did a great job of controlling and containing the community outbreaks during the lockdown. But the moment we lifted the lockdown, unfortunately, we haven't done a good job. And today, like everyone said, it's the vulnerable populations that are really getting the brunt of this.
So Kiran, I'm getting messages flashing on my screen saying we're going to be cut off soon. What I'd like to summarize, and I know this has been a very short time, but a couple of things that have come up. One is the focus on the vulnerable. 2 is strengthening public health systems. And 3 is working collaboratively across governments, public sector, private sector. As a humanity, we need to stand together because the viruses are standing together for sure. So Kiran, we can continue with your conversation. I just didn't want you to suddenly be cut off. They're telling me they'll cut us off in a few minutes, but finish your thought.
No, I was just saying that, so therefore, I think that there is a huge role to play in terms of coming out with new healthcare policies. There's a role for technology to bridge a lot of these inequities that we are seeing in the healthcare system across the world. I think every part of the world has seen that. And then, of course, there's this great collective effort, and I really hope that this collective effort is going to ensure, in a very equitable way, that there is no nationalism when it comes to making sure that the vaccines reach the patients who need it. I really think this is not about making profits, it's about public good.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we need to see at this time. I do hope that all the companies are going to look at this as an opportunity to do public good.
Thank you. Thank you, panel. I think it was very informative. Appreciate it. I too am confident we can be better prepared for the future if we come together and put down all our differences and embrace our universality. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, panel. That was just incredible. Unfortunately, it feels like the Oscars, where we have a certain amount of time and the music starts playing. And that's because this issue is so big and so broad, and so many voices need to be heard for us to understand not just the problem we're facing, but how we can best come together to address it. And that's what this movement is about. That's what this summit is about. And that's what we're here to do together. We talk before now, when we spoke about something going viral, we meant social media. Now we're realizing that the virus, by definition, goes viral. But what we've just heard is that hope, especially from David Nabarro, we've heard that hope is also viral. And that's what we're trying to unleash. We heard that the pandemic was predictable. It was preventable. And yet here we are because we didn't heed those warnings. And we look at climate change, it's another one of these same issues where many people around the world recognize the incredible challenge of climate change. But through Kyoto, Copenhagen, and Paris, we went from thinking about solving this problem globally to then just calling on countries to do the best they can as we fail in our response. It's the same model across so many of these big global issues that remain unaddressed. For our survival, we must do better. We've got to drive change at every level. And that certainly means at the international and national, but also on the local level. More than half of everyone on Earth lives in cities. Cities have a critical role of hubs, not just of innovation, but of creative response to big national challenges. And mayors, inspirational mayors, are leading that effort. One of the most inspirational mayors is my very good friend, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles. Eric?
Thanks for your great introduction, Jamie. And thank you for organizing this incredible summit and for never shying away from tackling humanity's biggest obstacles with the creativity, vision, and resolve that we all know you have. And I want to recognize all of the esteemed guests who are joining this event, hailing from our universities, human rights organizations, the public health community, and from points all around the globe. If history has shown us one thing, it's shown us that time and again, human beings thrive when we seek out connection and community. Whether as individuals or states, as cities or nations, our long-term success rarely happens in isolation. Instead, it takes collaboration across sectors, across borders. And yet for too long, global interdependence was seen as the purview of academic debates about the role of America in the world, or about the power of international institutions and the most effective ways to advance national interests, deliver prosperity, or strengthen peace and security. But in truth, there's nothing theoretical about interdependence. It has always been essential to how we solve the great problems of our time. Never has that been more clear than right now. With a pandemic that's touched every city and country on this planet, and that demands our collective response. With diseases that may start in one village or town, but spread quickly to our own doorsteps, faster than ever before. And then with the economic devastation that reaches into our businesses and workers and households without any regard for municipal boundaries with poverty and hunger that strike our shared moral conscience and fuel desperation and despair. And perhaps most of all, with a climate emergency forcing us to confront core existential questions of how we will survive and how we will secure a place for everyone in the economy of tomorrow. We can only answer these challenges through collaboration and cooperation, through a common commitment to policies rooted in science, in equity, and in justice, and by embracing our interconnectedness and using it to our advantage. It's the only way we will recover from COVID-19 and reimagine and rebuild a stronger future. The only way we can truly tackle climate change if we see our failure and success as tied to one another, if we continue to work as a united force for progress. I'm honored to serve as the chair of C40 Cities, a coalition rooted in that understanding that a network of great global cities has the power to take inclusive, lasting, and effective climate action. And we act on that belief every day, adopting a global Green New Deal that demands interdependence to succeed, a set of goals and standards meant to keep our promises of environmental justice and sustainability. And we formed a COVID-19 recovery task force that's developed clear, concrete steps to help our cities realize a green and just recovery. And we're leading the charge in our individual cities, whether it's putting electric buses on our roads or expanding public transit so people can get out of their cars, whether it's powering our homes and offices with renewable energy, or whether it's creating good-paying green jobs and reducing emissions in the frontline communities. We know that by working shoulder to shoulder, that we can see what works and apply it in our own cities. We can exchange our best practices with one another and hold each other accountable for the results that our people demand. That's interdependence at work. That is how we can and we will solve the climate crisis. That's a model for how we as local governments and national leaders, as scientists, economists, activists, everyday citizens, and more, can address the monumental trials before us. And we have no time to waste, no time to stand pat and argue over who bears the responsibility to save our planet. It's clear, it's all of us. We have no time to tackle COVID today, climate tomorrow, poverty when we get to it, and famine down the road. We have no time to argue over whether these issues are connected or whether it's smart to go it alone. We know what we need to do. We have to act now. We have to act united, and we have to rewrite the rules of our social compact and fulfill the pledges of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have to embrace our global interdependence and remember that we rise or we fall together. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you to answer this moment. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Eric. This is a call to arms to all of us. Maybe arms is the wrong word. It's a call to action for all of us because our future hangs in the balance. We want to hear from everybody on social media. You'll see some of these posts are being live streamed on the screen. We want to hear from you. We're going to have breakout sessions at the end of the summit a little bit later today. And the reason we want to hear from everybody is because what we are experiencing is a global collective action problem. It's the tragedy of the commons where we all benefit from so many shared resources, but we all don't feel the same responsibility to care for them. And the greatest and most precious resources are our fellow humans and our shared ecosystem with all of the creatures it inhabits. This failure to realize our connectivity to the whole is really a tragedy, not just in itself, but because we will all be so much better off if we think differently about our connectivity and our responsibility. And that's why it's my great pleasure to introduce another great friend of mine and a person who is a champion of saving our entire biosphere. Enrique Sala is an explorer in residence at National Geographic and the founder of Pristine Seas. He's also the author of an incredible new book that's just out called The Nature of Nature, Why We Need the Wild. Enrique is going to speak and then join a conversation with Catherine Constantides and Jess Fonzo. Enrique, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much, Jamie. You know, we're suffering a triple whammy. three plagues right now that are bringing us down to our knees. First, global warming and its impacts are intensifying. Wildfires are raging throughout the West. Hurricanes are forming bumper to bumper in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Second, we are losing nature faster than ever, like those forests that are gone, burned. And this week, migrating birds are falling from the sky by the thousands in the southwestern US. And third, the COVID-19 pandemic. But these are not different crises. They are all one and the same. And this pandemic is the loudest reminder for humanity that we are all connected, that our actions on one part of the planet can affect every other part of it. It only took one person to acquire a virus that came from wild animals to create a local outbreak in China that, thanks to our globalized lifestyle, spread like wildfire across the world. Farms intrude upon forests, and loggers and miners push into pristine ecosystems. That increases our chances of being exposed to new diseases for which we have no immunity. Now, let me give you another example of how everything is connected. The Congo Basin forest produces the rain that waters the highlands of Ethiopia. If we lose that forest, there is less water and food for 125 million people in Ethiopia at the other side of the continent. But those highlands also produce most of the water for the Nile. Less water in the Nile would be catastrophic for Egypt and Sudan, and that would result in conflict. So how can we create a future where both people and nature can thrive? And the plan is quite simple. Reduce our impact to ensure that everything we do, we can do forever. There are three main areas where we should focus. First, phasing out fossil fuels and replacing them with renewable energies. This will slow the warming of the planet and the destabilization of the climate, and it will also lead to clean air for all of us. Second, upgrading to efficient food production. Eat more plants and less meat. This will require less space and fresh water to feed ourselves, leaving more space for nature, and feeding more people with healthier and more affordable food. And third, protecting at least 30% of the planet by 2030. Indigenous peoples have a key role in this, since they have shown to be better managers of the land than corporations. Wild places and the species that live in them are our life support system. They generate the air we breathe. They produce the food we eat. They clean the water we drink and protect us from devastating floods. Habitats with a diversity of plants and animals also dilute any viruses that emerge. Biodiversity provides a natural shield that absorbs the fallout from pathogens. Intact, functioning ecosystems are our best vaccine. They are also our single best hope for protecting against climate catastrophe. Our forests, grasslands, wetlands, and ocean habitats absorb half of the excess carbon that we expel into the atmosphere every year. Without intact wild places, it will be impossible to achieve the Paris climate goals. All of this means that the global crisis isn't just about saving nature or the climate. It's about saving ourselves. But here's the good news. We can save ourselves. Right now, the world ought to double down to help those in need. But we should start building back better to make ourselves more resilient for the future. It's an ambitious goal, but it's possible. And the economic benefits of investing in nature and halting global warming far outweigh the costs. This pandemic is the loudest reminder for humanity that we are all connected and interdependent with all other creatures on Earth, not just us humans. That our actions on one part of the world can affect every other part of it. Phasing out fossil fuels, changing the way we produce food, and the protection of our natural world is the vaccine we need right now before it's too late. Even if it's just for selfish reasons, for our own survival. Now more than ever, we need to act as we are all in this together, because we are. Thank you.
I would like to just say thank you so much to Enrique Sala and to Mayor Garcetti for their wonderful introductions and remarks. I think we're reminded that there's certainly one day there will be a vaccine for COVID-19, and we're working towards that. but there isn't a vaccine for climate change. It is something we really need to be ensuring is part of our daily discussion and agenda, because our lives do certainly, as Enrique say, our lives depend on it. And on that note, I'd like to bring in another speaker who is with us today. My name is Catherine Constantinides, and as the moderator of this very brief session, food security coming from a country like South Africa is of paramount importance. And during COVID-19, we have seen the plight of hunger in our country and the inequality that exists. And food security and food systems are certainly so important to the way that we rebuild the future that we envisage. And efficient food systems, as Enrique has mentioned, are critical. So I would like to ask that Jamie come on and just give us a bit of, from your perspective, when we look at the pandemic, when we look at food security, what do we need to do? How do we bridge the gaps that we find, and where are we needing to move to as a collective?
So the gaps are exactly what Enrique and Eric Garcetti have mentioned. It's a gap between what is possible, what we know is possible, and what we are, the world that we have constructed for ourselves. Our problems are all human-made, and our responses can equally be human-made. But everyone's heard too much from me, so I'm going to pop back out and
I'm going to ask Jess to just jump in and just give us a bit of an understanding from food security and an agricultural space. Where do we need to move towards, and how do we need to get there as collective action, as something that is extremely important in the day and age we find ourselves in?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. It's great to be here. And I think Enrique really highlighted the big issues that we see. I mean, food touches on those three pandemics that he talked about, climate, COVID, as well as nature. I mean, food systems are victims and instigators of climate change and disruption. The COVID pandemic, its origins started in the food system and the shrinking natural habitats, putting animals in very close proximity to humans. And if we don't have nature, we don't have the biodiversity, we don't have the diverse, rich landscapes that many indigenous peoples care for, we're not going to have a diverse food supply. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Diets around the world are monotonous, they lack variety, they're highly processed, and diets which are meant to nourish us have become the #1 killer in the world. They're the #1 risk factor of disease and mortality. And that's devastating. And we know what to do. We know how to improve food systems. We know how to improve food production, making them more diverse, rich in biodiversity. But we also need to think downstream of production systems. How do we ensure that people get access and can afford that more dominant plant-based healthy diet? It's unaffordable for approximately 1.6 billion people. And that's where the inequities lie, and where governments need to step in and take action and ensure that our entire food system is equitable for those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized, and are going to be suffering the consequences of the decisions that many of us in high-income countries are making on climate. So we have plenty of actions now on how to improve the food system, not only in production systems, but making food environments more accessible, more affordable. It's just a matter of governments taking action and actually caring about food. And I hope that the UN Food Summit in 2021 will be a moment for concrete financial and governmental action towards food systems.
Both to Jess and Enrique, in kind of wrapping up, I would want to ask, it's really important that we see political power put behind what we need done when we talk about climate action. And I think OneShared.World's platform is truly, truly important when we are ensuring that we're trying to create a new collective understanding of what the vision of the future looks like. How do we ensure that climate change is given the prominence and importance that it needs in the time frame and the world where political leaders are talking against climate change? And when we're fighting something so real, how do we ensure that we're able to bridge the gap and bring civil society on board in order to put real pressure on governments around the world?
Well, something that needs to happen this year in the United States is that people have to vote. People have to vote for the candidate who shares their environmental values and their climate values. The United States is going to rejoin or continue in the Paris Climate Agreement or leave it, depending on who wins the election. So this is absolutely key, and everybody has a responsibility. And there is no excuse anymore about climate change happening to somebody else sometime in the future. It's happening now. It's been happening for a long time, and the communities in the southern United States with these double hurricanes and the communities on the west are suffering. We have the governor of California saying, this is a climate crisis. We have no more time for contrarians. We just need to plan to build better, to build for resilience, not for hyper leverage and fetter growth, which is what got us into this situation in the first place.
Thank you so much. Jess, do you want to just give us a last word quickly in a minute just to wrap up?
Well, I think everyone is an expert on food because we eat every day. And the choices that you make are not only affecting your own health, but the choices that you make affect people in South Africa and everywhere around the world. So I encourage everyone to, of course, push your government's vote, as Enrique said, especially in the United States, but also think about what you're eating. Where does it come from? What are the potential consequences for someone halfway around the world? Because we are all connected, and the global food system is incredibly connected. So you are the expert and you have choices. Yeah,
absolutely. Climate, community, and connection. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
From our conversation, it's that building a better world is up to all of us. As the son of a refugee myself, I know a little bit about how much can be lost when people become victims to war, poverty, and so many other terrible things. But I also know a little bit about what is possible when people are given just a little chance, how much people can come together to build a better world. Our partners at FilmAid and Internews have worked with refugee filmmakers in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya to put together the small video that we're about to see, which will be followed by a conversation among some very special people.
Kakuma is a land of different people. You find people from all over the world, all over the continent, especially Africa, where I found that people from very different places, very different backgrounds, very different stories came together and made a story out of a script. And they not only connected in Kakuma, but also outside Kakuma. The film was produced by different people and everybody brought their own idea into the table. This strengthened our story. Despite my refugee status and the limits attached to it, I have not been deterred from getting to where I am today. I am simply a human demanding the dignity that my refugee status is currently denying me. If you treat me as an equal, then we'll solve this world's problem together. I am an equal part of the solution to the refugee crisis and not a problem to be solved by others.
I'm a South Sudanese by nationality, living in Kakuma refugee camp. My dad managed to go back to South Sudan, where he was able to secure a job. I was left with my mother in the camp. My father knew that education was our best bet to a better future. He worked really hard to ensure that all our needs were met while at school. He believed that there was a man in us, in that the society was always like men or boys were best to be supported through education. He made sure my sisters and I's needs were met at school. He encouraged us and he made sure we were comfortable at school. Being a refugee comes with various limitations and restrictions. But with all of this, I managed to finish school and get a good grade. My sister, who is a teacher, once said, "The winners of today were losers of yesterday, but who decided not to give up." Kakuma is a community of people who have chosen not to give up. When trying to solve the world's problems, there's a lot you can learn from the people who refuse to quit.
Thank you so much. One thing that I think should be clear to everybody right now in the midst of this terrible pandemic is that there is no us and them. There's only us and us. No matter how high the walls we build, This virus is finding our weaknesses. It's finding our vulnerabilities. It's pointing its fingers at all of us and asking us what we've done to build the kind of fair and equitable world where everyone is protected. Because even if the wealthier countries are able to minimally fight back the virus, if it grows and spreads among the world's most vulnerable populations, it will mutate and then it will come back and we will all be in danger. That's why the name of this summit is Rise or Fall Together. That's what the virus shows us. That's what climate change shows us. That if we break ourselves down into these nonsensical divisions, and again, we're not against countries, but if we don't recognize that we're all in this together, we're going to be in great danger. That's also why the first report that OneShared.World created was called Rise or Fall Together, addressing the emergency needs of the world's most vulnerable populations. We encourage everyone to go to the OneShared.World website and not just read that report with its strong recommendations, but also join on to the campaign calling on leaders around the world to address the urgent needs of these vulnerable populations. There was a time when we thought of this kind of intervention as charity. And certainly it's very charitable to help people in need. But the frame of interdependence forces us to think differently about how we work with others. If our health and well-being reside in everybody else and in our common home and biosphere, helping to ensure that everybody and all of us and our planet is safe isn't just charity. It's the smartest investment that we can make in our future. That's what this is all about. It's estimated that COVID will cost world governments and cost the world $82 trillion of lost revenue and expense over the next 5 years. What percentage of that should we invest in building a safer world for everyone? With that, I'd like to invite my friend Manoj Kumar, who's a social entrepreneur in India and founder of the Nandi Foundation, to join me on the stage.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you very much. This is a very inspired moment. And joining me are two amazing human beings who are doing this extraordinary work to creating a better shared world for us. One of them is all the way from a refugee camp in Dadaab, Mohammed Abdullahi Jimale. Welcome, Mohammed. And the other gentleman is my brother from Kashmir, Mohsin Mohiuddin, who is the founder and CEO of Maybe International. So the three of us are going to talk about the section on how do we address systemic poverty and inequality. And before we ask them the questions, let me just tell you 2-3 quick headlines. One, we signed this Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, the world signed in 2015. And the first one is that no poverty. But today, we have 736 million people who still live in extreme poverty on less than US $1.9 per day. We have 1.3 billion people who live in multidimensional poverty. And 50% of all the people living below poverty are below the age of 18. So we have a very fractured world where the future generation is going to be completely affected. So I worked with the Nandi Foundation for the last 20 years, working with some of the poorest communities in India. Most significant being my work with tribals who are dispossessed, marginalized, called Adivasis originally in India, in the region of Araku. When I was with the Araku Valley farmers, what struck me, what they taught me, is that their poverty will also eventually affect the life of people in Silicon Valley. Such was the interdependence that they taught me. But before I tell you that, let me ask this question to Mohsin. Mohsin, tell me, you have been in refugee camps, you have been working with people in conflict. Tell me from your life in different communities, how did you see intergenerational poverty affecting different communities in an interconnected manner?
Yeah, thank you, Manoj. It's an honor to be here. Well, let's talk on a human level outside of the science of economics, because economics is just a term created for human beings on a human level. We see that pain and suffering that is not transformed becomes transmitted. And we see this on the level of brothers and sisters from vulnerable communities who are forced to live in broken systems that are not transforming pain and suffering, but designed to transmit it. So what we end up seeing, especially during COVID, you have brothers and sisters in the camps who do not have the luxury and the currency of physical space, who are close together. Mental health becomes under threat or exacerbated more than it already was. Domestic violence and aggression goes from the mother and father or husband and wife to the child and onwards down. Social spaces being shut down, such as schools. I think when we think about the inequality that lives in economics, we have to think, where does inequality start? It starts with the body. It starts with how the brain communicates to our body and how we respond to the disruptions around us. What we're seeing in the work that we're doing with MIU International is that inequality lives in language. Inequality lives in the word economics. So we have to step back as a human species and look at tens of thousands of years since the communications revolution enabled our species to survive. How have we been using it? Communications has been weaponized. Language has been used to subjugate and oppress instead of encourage cooperation and harmony. And that transfers down to language. Language is being weaponized and is being used to subjugate and oppress instead of connecting people together. And that feeds into economics and how we use the word. So we have to transform instead of transmit. And the way that we do that is to reframe how we communicate within ourselves, because how we treat ourselves impacts how we treat the people and planet around us. We have to start from the internal level.
Thank you, Mohsin. So I'm going to ask Mohammed. Mohammed was born in a refugee camp, raised in a refugee camp, and there cannot be something more powerful in terms of the fractured lives that you created for refugees. They don't even have a passport. So I'm going to ask Mohammed. Mohammed, tell us, you are also a humanitarian journalist. What is the main message or story that you want to tell about life in a refugee camp? How can we outside people with passport know about the pain and the dependence that we should have with you? Tell us your message.
Mohammed, can you hear us?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Oh, great. So we just have we're so glad. Thank you, Manoj. So as Manoj said in his introduction, Mohammed is speaking to us in a live stream from his refugee camp in Kenya. We've gotten to know him over these last days and weeks, and really just an incredible inspiration to all of us. Mohammed, can you talk a little bit about your experience and in the few moments that we have, connect that to your vision of how we can all come together to solve our greatest problems?
Thank you very much. As mentioned earlier, my name is Mohammed Jamal. I'm a Somali refugee living in Kenya's northeastern province in a place called the Dab refugee camp. The Dab refugee camp is not an isolated place. The Dab has a population of over 200,000 refugees from 8 different nationalities. Majority of them, somebody like me, has spent the whole of his life in a refugee camp. Like, I was born and raised in a refugee camp. My parents came from Somalia to look for asylum in Kenya. So here in the refugee camps, they have the refugee issue has been a global challenge all over the world. So, poverty is one of the things, one of the challenges as to why refugees run. Poverty and war is one of the things, or one of the challenges that refugees run away from their home countries in search of security and food. So one common thing and one reason as to why people flee from their country is because of inequality. I can say if there is equality across the whole world, there will not be poverty. For example, Africa now is not poor because it does not have resources. There are resources in Africa, but the reason as to why some countries in Africa are associated with poor is because there is inequality in it. So if all of us, if you can have a world where we have shared opportunities, where we have equal opportunities for everybody, I can say, I believe we can have a better world than the world we live in now. Than the world we live in now.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. You're really an inspiration. As I said earlier, it's people like you seeing light where others see darkness, which is an inspiration to everybody to work harder to build the world that we all dream of. So thank you, thank you. And thank you to panelists. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the inestimable Susie Jamil.
Hello, everyone. My name is Susie. I'm the owner and director of Think Inc., which is a very proud sponsor of today's summit, streaming live to you from Sydney, Australia. I'm very proud to introduce to you one of my favorite Australian hip-hop artists. His music covers a range of issues with social justice focuses, including issues of racism and prejudice. Please welcome to the stage, El Fresh the Lion.
We are not alone in this world of ours. A suitable sight to behold, I call it home. Where dreams are seeds planted, nourished by love and understanding. So a beautiful reality's wrong. Minds get blown wide open when they travel the globe. Here's hoping there's a round ticket for the average soul to come to understand the many ways of life for man, and that it's by pure luck we get to call a country our own. But some have their roots so uprooted they have to leave it, even if they hearts aren't in agreement. But the goal's to survive working overtime during holiday seasons. You see, my parents were too busy for grieving. If only you could see them, what they give back to the land that feeds them. Sown with their own hands, opportunities for their children to exercise their freedom, realize our potential and strive for great achievements. To be grateful, I don't need a reason. Born in Southwest Sydney, I'm thankful to be breathing. A son of two migrants who arrived as strange visitors in a foreign land that became willing participants. Their culture kept them strung while people dissed their differences, celebrating Versace while treating us to Christmases. Now our smiles are on display as framed images hanging above the desk where I write this as a lyricist. This is our world. It cannot be taken from me. It cannot be taken from me. This is our world. It cannot be taken from me. It cannot be taken from me. This is our world. It cannot be taken from me. It cannot be taken from me. Yeah, 'cause basically, this is our world. This is our world. Ignorance breeds fear, so I've been told, and fear makes your heart go cold. But there's countless stories that go untold, which make me realize that there's so much in this world I'll never know. Shit. In this world I'll never know. There's so much in this world I'll never know. So I take a look around, soak it in and double down. There's much complexity involved, why do we dumb it down? I get up early morning, yawning as I awake, resisting the visions that make my mental break. Fantasizing about a world where equality is realized and there's equity for those whose motherlands are colonized. History repeats, so lying, don't you sleep. Your future's been predicted in a tirade of tweets, trying to succeed in a system not designed for me. The proof's in the everyday if you decide for what you see. Some lives are valued more and others are valued less. There's rich and white on one end, on the other's indigenous. Tell me that ain't some wickedness. Nothing to change if we stay focused on our own lanes and self-interest. I don't do politics, so I can't spin it divided less. Living in a divided world, trying to be divisionless. Shouting to deaf ears in a nation of indifference. Surrounded by man-made walls, we're all prisoners. Trapped in a cycle of common sections and statuses. Void of any compassion, facts or analysis. Trying to gather up the energy to make it through the savageness. This a one-way train, I smile and wave at the passengers. Surely there's another way, another path. I was taught love always wins, cause hate can never last. And a story can soften even the hardest of hearts. If that's the case, maybe victory's within our grasp. This is our world. It cannot be taken from me. Yeah, it cannot be taken from me. Hey, this is our world. It cannot be taken from me. Yeah, it cannot be taken from me. So this is our world. It cannot be taken from me. It cannot be taken from me. Yeah, cause basically, this is our world. Yeah, this is our world.
Hey everybody, it's an honor to be here for One Shared World, and my name is Alfresh the Lion from Southwest Sydney, Australia. That song that you just saw and that music video you just saw is my humble attempt to try to have this conversation that we seem to be having today at this One Shared World event. For me, the key concept of what I was trying to communicate with this song was understanding. You know, we live in a time where we are more connected digitally, but we feel divided, you know, in many respects. The space around us, the world around us is having to endure some of the greatest challenges of our time, from climate change to, you know, divisions around race, systemic issues that perpetuate, you know, ignorance and whatnot. So these are some really big challenges. The idea of the song was to try to communicate, you know, that storytelling can help promote understanding. It can break down some of the barriers that, you know, that has been created from these divisions that we have perpetuated. And I wanted to introduce this concept of how, you know, how systemically these issues can be perpetuated. So, you know, it was just my humble attempt to really try to communicate those things, because at the end of the day, we are shared in this experience of life through our connection with each other through humanity, and our humanness is at its core, right? We all have an experience of life on this place we are fortunate to call planet Earth. And you know, these issues that we have to rise to the challenge to meet, you know, they're not going away. So we need to find a way to meet each other in shared spaces with a level of understanding, so we can come together and take on these challenges. So, you know, if we don't do that, you know, those challenges may be more difficult to overcome, and especially for future generations. You know, we have a responsibility to try to improve the world around us while we are here on this time that we've been given on Earth. So, you know, that song, Our World, was just that humble attempt to really communicate that message. And, you know, seeing the comments come in and seeing you all have this conversation, I think is great. It's really important. It's something that I feel we need more of. You know, we need to build that shared understanding around the world, so we can, you know, rise to that challenge together. So like I said, it's an honor and a privilege to be here for One Shared World, and to be a part of this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alfresh. It's really a great honor to have you here, because art and culture is the language of our common humanity. We all need to recognize that we're artists, and our palette is the world, and our expression is every action that we take. So thank you so much for sharing those beautiful thoughts with us. And thanks everybody for joining us. We have 40,000 people watching this right now. 250,000 Twitter impressions, nearly people in nearly 100 countries. So this is really exciting. And what we want is everybody to feel empowered, engaged, part of a movement, a growing community. And to drive this change, though, music and culture are really important, but we need to think differently about how our world is organized. If the key words for 1648, when the Peace of Westphalia ended the 30 Years' War, was state sovereignty, our new model of how states function, and the key words for 1945, at the end of 2 world wars, when we built this international system with the United Nations, was international. For us to survive, the key words of 2020 have to be the mutual responsibilities of interdependence. And so for our next section, we are going to include some of the greatest thinkers about the structures of our world to explore this critical issue. Our first speaker is Joe Nye, who's a professor emeritus at Harvard and who literally wrote the book on interdependence. It's my great honor to introduce Joe Nye.
Well, thank you, Jamie. And I must say that you're absolutely right that the world today is so interdependent that we have to change the way we think. If one looks at something like, let's say, climate change or the current pandemic, you realize that these transnational interdependencies are not problems that any one country can solve by itself. In fact, we have to rethink the way we consider power. Power, we often think in competitive terms, power over others. But there are some problems arising out of interdependence where you can only solve them if you think of power with others. So, for example, the US or Europe or China cannot solve the climate problem they're going to suffer from acting alone. They can only solve it if they act with each other. And that goes for all nations. I just use those as simple examples. Along with that goes the point that we're going to have to redefine the way we think about what we call our national interest. Presidents, of course, have to defend a national interest because they're elected as trustees for the people who elect them. But as I try to argue in a new book, which I've just written, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, the key question is not whether a president says, I will defend the national interest. It's the moral question is, how does he or she define the national interest? And you can either define it narrowly, where it's yours alone, I win, you lose, or you can define it broadly for a long-term perspective in which we both win. In that sense, I argue that if you look back on American foreign policy and you take the example of something like the Marshall Plan, the Americans gave away about 2% of their gross domestic product to Europe. That was out of American self-interest, but was also in European self-interest. So it's possible to think of the national interest in ways which recognize this new interdependence. If you bring that back then to what I mentioned about the current COVID crisis, instead of vaccine nationalism and this view that everybody's going to look out just for themselves, I wish that the United States and other countries would declare that they're going to reserve a certain proportion of the vaccines which are produced within their borders for other countries, particularly poor countries, which do not have health capacity or health systems with full capacity. And you might say, well, why would anybody exercise this sort of charity? The answer is it's not just charity, it's also a reaction to interdependence. The northern half of the globe is not going to be safe from pandemics or from COVID if there's a reservoir of such viruses in the southern half of the globe. So if we think about interdependence, we can realize that it should lead us to rethink power and rethink how we define our national interests. And that's what I try to argue in this book I mentioned, Do Morals Matter? Yes, they do, and more than ever in a world which is marked by this growing interdependence. So thanks for your attention and thanks for your initiative in helping to bring us together on this.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm waiting for Lloyd. I'm sorry.
Hello, Jamie.
Hi, my name is. Hi. Hello to everyone from Brussels. I have to say sunny Brussels, in many ways sunny. I'm very happy to join this great panel. We don't have much time, but we'll try to touch on the most important things that are linked to this subject. Europe, here in Europe, we are all about mutual responsibility, because we have learned through our past that we are much stronger if we work together and if we take care of each other, be it in health, economy, peace, human dignity. And this is how we see the world, but it has been a bit lonelier in the last years. It seems that the world is growing more interdependent, but there is less cooperation. As Professor Nigel said, we need to change the way we think. And I'm asking the panelists, the Professor Falk and from Princeton, and Minister Togbater, I think I hope I have pronounced your name well, to join. Yes, great, thanks. To join us and tell us first, how do we came here and how do we fix this? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, all right.
Yes, go ahead.
Good. Well, we're living in the world of, in the changing world. And, well, the world was always changing. It was never static. But the thing is that with the coronavirus, the changes have accelerated. And, all of a sudden, for example, I've been in the field of diplomacy for many years, and we were talking about digital technology and the use of the digital technology, etc. But all of a sudden, with the coronavirus, what we're seeing now is that the global diplomacy had to move in rapidly into the use of much broader use of digital technology, and it has already become part of global diplomacy. And now today, for example, we're having this digital meeting from around the world, and the General Assembly is actually, for the first time, is being conducted in digital format. So in this sense, the world has really started changing very fast. And in these times of changes, we're witnessing also doubts and hesitations as to the efficiency of the global international architecture that we're having. But very important thing is that, yes, we're having hesitation about the efficiency, but there is one thing that we really have to understand, that this world can be efficient and can interact efficiently only when we're together and when we strengthen, not weaken, our international institutions. Mongolia has been a very strong, proponent and advocate of multilateralism and international institutions. And in these difficult times of challenges, the United Nations and the strength of the United Nations has to be really developed further. And we also see that international agencies and institutions like WHO need to be strengthened further. For example, Mongolia is one of few countries where we did not have a single case of human-to-human coronavirus transmission. All of the cases are reported, and we've been treating them pretty successfully, and we do not have a single fatality in Mongolia. But the WHO guidance and the WHO advisory service for Mongolia was instrumental in securing what we have today. And within Mongolia, we have pretty safe environment where people feel, pretty safe about the quarantine system that we're having. But the beauty of the situation today is that this is the time where we empirically really see that the world cannot be separated. Before Corona, if we talked about isolationism, protectionism, it would have been philosophical discussion. But with Corona, countries closed the borders, and all the countries are now waiting for reopening of the borders. And they really start realizing that this world cannot function without this interconnectedness. And from this perspective, this declaration of interdependence was a very good thing to come up with. And, again, when we're talking about this declaration of interdependence, what we're also seeing that, institutions like W.H.O should be strengthened, not only globally, but at the regional levels as well. And Mongolia came up with the initiative to set up rapid deployment medical units in the regions under the guidance of the WHO. We've been investing so much, funds into creating military rapid deployment units for peacekeeping, etc., for the defense purposes. But we were not investing into the infrastructure to prevent this sort of possibility of pandemics. And when we really start realizing that, especially in times of pandemics, if you secured your country, it's really not enough. If your neighbor has the cases, then no matter how strong your quarantine is, you're always under constant threat of transmission. And therefore, you're secure when your neighbor is secure. My neighbor is secure when their neighbor is secure. And from this perspective, this pandemic is really teaching us that this global response institutions need to be created, and we need to have also very novel approaches. Spend less money on military, spend more money on the creating medical infrastructure to prevent this sort of disease outbreaks in the future, because this is not the only case. There will be more pandemics, and therefore we need to have more efficient systems and really think seriously about it. So again, the lesson is that interconnectedness is very important. This is really showing us on empirical basis, which otherwise we would not have had, that this world on its own cannot operate. And this is the lesson that we really need to carry through in the future.
Awesome, thank you. If you weren't my Mongolian brother, I wouldn't feel empowered to come in and say, love you, awesome. We have very limited time. And so we have two more voices that we really are important that we hear from in the final 1 or 2 minutes that we have for this session. And again, we have hundreds of thousands of people in the world tuning in. All of these conversations must go on social media and other platforms. So this is just to bring everybody into this dialogue. So first we'll hear, and back to you, Romana, for a quick thoughts from Richard Falk, who's really, if we had an all-star team of international law scholars of history, Richard would be the pitcher. And then we're going to hear from former Canadian Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy.
Thanks, Professor. Please.
Thank you so much. I congratulate the conveners for bringing us together on this theme. In my view, the world is haunted at the moment by a deadly paradox that we have never needed to heed the lessons of interdependence and mutual responsibility more than we do today. And yet, the political leadership of most of the important countries in the world is victimized by what I would describe as a resurgent nationalism that is rather hostile to a cooperative approach to its foreign policy objectives and to generally pursuing its interests. International law and the United Nations were in many ways the best meant instrumentalities for arranging effective global cooperation, and they are at odds with this kind of ultranationalist autocratic leadership that looks toward the international community with a rather dismissive attitude. So I think we have to face this paradoxical situation that interdependence is pressing us to find solutions to dangerous and potentially catastrophic challenges, and yet the political leadership of the world is oriented toward excessive militarism, exploitative forms of economic development, and so we're not getting this essential job done at this critical time in human history.
Thank you, Professor. I think we go to Mr. Exworthy. Lloyd?
You hear me okay? Let me just thank you for the opportunity to be together. I want to say, by the way, that this interdependence is very clearly illustrated on the screen, where Richard Falk was my professor and mentor on international law many years ago, for which I owe a great deal of his guidance. And Joe Nye and his theory on soft power was something, as a foreign minister in Canada, I tried to apply. So I'm really speaking from the point of view of a practitioner who had some remnants of academia still lingering in my DNA. The point I want to make is that, coming as a practitioner of 30 years, both elected and in cabinet posts, particularly in foreign affairs, what we tried to develop was, how do you apply an idea to a practice? How do you take a concept to action? And what we worked on, of course, as many of you know, is the human security idea, which is the protection of people. I think it's a very appropriate concept today in this interdependent world, because as Joe and I just said, you've got a bunch of leaders who are xenophobic and nationalists and are really out to take the international system and convert it to their own particular ideology and their own particular worldview. The Chinese are doing it subtly at the UN. The United States are America first, and you've got a bunch of others of similar ilk. What we tried to do in Pioneer was to bring together networks, getting around the kind of barriers that were being set up. And I want to just use the quick illustration of the landmine treaty, that we put together a coalition of civil society, key governments who were like-minded, international agencies. We had the help of Princess Diana. But as a result, we were able to short circuit the kind of blockages and barriers that great powers were putting in the way for any form of a disarmament or an arms control system. It's now been, there's over 160 countries, and it's working well, but it's the idea of a network and connectivity. And I think I just want to make this point, that we're now in a world where the emergence of political women leaders is becoming a new factor. I think the whole notion of, as the ambassador will tell you, of being able to connect that digitally and bring that new kind of a global democracy into play with international institutions. Certainly, I think that the emergence of a much stronger role of the street, the public square, the protest, these kinds of things are having a huge impact. And I think now it needs to be mobilized around these convergence of epidemics and climate and conflict, to be able to provide some form of a network through the Refugee Council. That's what we're doing. And I think that, to me, isn't. Okay, Jamie,
thank you so much.
We didn't have much time.
No, I know. And every one of these conversations deserves to be a day. And I mentioned this as an all-star team, to have two former foreign ministers, brilliant people, to have two of the really deans of the international affairs, international law community of history, and the EU ambassador at large for connectivity. These are really essential conversations. And I wouldn't interrupt but for we have a very, very special guest who is coming. So thank you all so much for this great panel. And our next speaker, it's a little bit challenging to introduce this person. I've had the great privilege of having multiple audiences in Dharamshala with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And one thing that struck me wasn't just his wisdom, but his great sense of joy and happiness and humor. And so I hope it's not inappropriate for me to tell my only Dalai Lama joke as part of this introduction, which is the Dalai Lama walks into a pizza parlor and says, "Make me one with everything." I don't hear anybody laughing, but that could just be the virtual world. The Dalai Lama is one of the most respected teachers, elders, wisdom providers, and humanitarians in the world. And it's just my unbelievable honor to welcome His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama.
Now, today's world, in a way, becomes smaller. So what happened in one place, it effect reach everywhere. So obviously, now it is very, very clear, heavily interdependent, including our health and, of course, economy. So now, such a reality, we should have the view, entire 7 billion human beings, our own future, very much interdependent. So when think your own interest, you have to think about the whole world, because our own individual interest actually depend on the whole world, like that. Like it's a Buddhist concept, particularly the Sanskrit, the concept, we are selfish. The best way to take care of self is taking care of other. So that's, I think, very practical. Now today's world is to take care about the whole world, because it interdependent. That's the best way to fulfill your own interest. So according to today's reality, just think oneself is narrow-minded, and actually, you see, the very basis of your own future neglected. So therefore, now today, we really need the sense of sort of well-being of 7 billion human beings. So here, we Tibetan, the Nalanda tradition, and like Shantadeva's book, you see, take care about other, you get best interest, best sort of, best benefit.
Thank you, Your Holiness, for your most inspiring teachings. As a member of OneShared.World's core leadership team, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next group of panelists. W.H.O is CEO of Rotary International with 1.4 million business and professional leaders. Rikin Patel is the founding president of Abaz, a global civic organization in the world's largest online activist community. Sam Worthington is CEO of Interaction, the U.S. largest alliance in relief and development NGO. And Miguel Lopez de Salinas is the market leader for Europe and Latin America of the Family Office Exchange, and is our moderator today. Welcome all.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the kind introduction, and welcome to this panel titled Building a Civil Society Network of Networks. As we heard Jamie this morning opening the summit, basically there is a big mismatch between the global problems and the national governance, as you know. So one way to bridge this gap is to give a stronger voice or a unified voice to civil society. And in this respect, we are very honored to have the three mentioned civil society leaders, Sam, John, and Riken. So in this respect, they lead very, very successful civil society organizations and networks with several million members, as Jim mentioned. So first question will be the same one for all of you. In maybe 2 minutes, can you let us know 2 or 3 lessons learned on how your organizations became the global networks they are and the vehicles of change they are currently are? Let me start with Sam, then John, then Riken.
So thank you, Miguel. And so one of the greatest creations of the 20th century was this creation of civil society and formalizing civil society organizations. Our organization was built as a principle-based platform for over 30 years now, and we bring together hundreds of organizations representing a broad diversity of the U.S. NGO work around the world. Some of them have been around for a century, others are just right now trying to address the cry for dignity and justice. We have learned that no one organization or small group has the power to influence government at the scale needed to respond to today's global challenges. We must create networks. And recently, we've learned that we need to create these networks by going global, by creating networks of networks. For over a decade, we've worked with consortia across the world in India, Brazil, Senegal, Cambodia, or even Somalia to build an interconnected web of organizations. And without these civil society voice, governments will not evolve. And to build these platforms, these networks of networks, they must be built on common values. They must be centered in principled coalitions. We need to focus on the connections of all the parts as not the center of the web. Its leadership is the strength of the coalition, not egos or political agendas. It cannot be led by one branded organization. And ultimately, it needs to be built on inclusivity, a space to co-create common goals, our values, our power. And we need to have the courage to imagine and create, the courage to speak truth to power, and the humility to do so with a common agenda. And everything we build must be built on a foundation of mutual trust and respect.
Thank you very much, Sam. Can we hear from John?
Great, Miguel, thank you. Thanks again for having me here. As you mentioned in the intro, Rotary is a global organization. We have 1.2 million Rotarians organized around 36,000 clubs around the world. And today, 75% of our membership is actually outside of North America. We were established in 1905 in Chicago, really as a networking, a business networking organization to start with. So we were the original LinkedIn before anyone had ever heard of LinkedIn. And then we've added to that the component of doing good, giving back to your community. And so I think the success that Rotary's had over 115 years of building networks and making a difference in the world, I think there are two key reasons. One is, and 2 key lessons I think that we can take away from the Rotary 115-year experience. The first was really a clear understanding of our shared values. And there are 2 in particular that I think are absolutely critical. One was is a deeply embedded culture of doing good. And the second is a genuine ethos to bring people across the spectrum to do good. You know, there's no second-class citizens in Rotary. And I think the second lesson was that in addition to the strong ethos that I just talked about, the strong shared values that I talked about, we've been able to successfully develop what I would call a centralized, decentralized model, where we have an organizational structure that provides a broad framework of strategy, of shared values, of direction, but coupled with a very strong decentralized flexibility. And then this allows us to very successfully implement top-down initiatives like the eradication of polio. You know, back in 1985, Rotary, a nonprofit, not a government agency or multilateral institution, had the audacity to say we are going to eradicate polio from the face of the earth. And we're very, very close to doing that. And so that centralized approach was possible given the model we've developed to have a very successful top-down initiative. But also because of this decentralized flexibility, we've been able to unleash the creativity and power of our 1.2 million Rotarians to do countless projects around the world, locally, globally, in a sort of entropy-like fashion in a slew of areas: water and sanitation, literacy, bringing people together. We run one of the largest student exchange programs in the world. So I think the lessons learned from Rotary is individuals can have a huge difference. There's a huge difference in the power of interconnectivity of individuals. And the lesson is a strong shared value system, but also a centralized, sort of decentralized model that allows both top-down and bottom-up activity to occur.
Thank you very much, John. And over to you, Ricken.
Yeah, thanks. Great to hear these lessons and insights. Avaz is a global civic movement, online, offline, 63 million subscribers. We're the newbies. We've just been around for 13 years. And what I would say some of the learning is, first of all, our foundations are very much the same as OneShared.World. Like, it's very much rooted in this idea that this revolutionary idea that there is a world most of us everywhere want. And if we could just come together around it, amidst all the ways in which extremists and power and interest distract and pull us apart as a people, if we can come together around the shared values and shared directions that we want, we can achieve those things. It's a very simple idea. And I think it has resonated. And that's where I would go with lessons, which is when I first started, a lot of people said to me, this kind of movement isn't going to work. People aren't interested in global stuff. You got to go national. You have to be kind of segmented. And we just experimented. We put stuff out into the world and people liked it. And so what I would say in terms of the lesson is, in the old world, it was all broadcast. It was all kind of a gatekeeper of power and information and consciousness decides what to put out there. And, powerful newspaper editors or governments or things like that. We're moving into a world where everything is networked, where each individual in each group is connected to multiple other individuals and groups, and where each person can publish in a way that reaches everyone else potentially if what they say resonates. And that's the key thing. It's not that the old world isn't relevant. It's still very relevant, the broadcast model and power and stuff like that. But now it's not as much who you know as what you say. And if you say, like we didn't have any megaphone when we started, we just said things that resonated with people. And we were very careful. That's what we got good at, is saying things that resonated with people, and that spread. And that connected to people who are connected in all their own networks in lots of different ways that built this movement. And so yeah, now we're speaking with a voice that represents 60 million people, and we've done 3,000 campaigns and 500 million actions. And we're going to keep going, and very, very happy to be part of this beautiful effort.
Excellent. Thank you, Ricken. So very, very common answers: scale, common values such as inclusivity, mutual trust, doing good, a very decentralized model, empowerment in the case of Ricken. And what you say is really relevant because it resonates around the world. So the second question is essentially now, what can we do now to do even more, right? To solve the world's greatest issues in terms of uniting society, bringing about real change. So thinking out of the box, thinking boldly, thinking surpassing today's limitations. The order will be now Ricken, John, and Sam. Let me start with Ricken.
Okay, limited time, so I'm going to just zero in on one thing, which is there is a natural way. Like, the network is the kind of wisdom of biology. Biology, ecosystems are organized according to network principles, and so is humanity. And there's this beautiful book I've been a fan of for a while called The Global Brain by Howard Bloom. And it talks about the analogy between individuals and how we fire with ideas and share with each other and come together, and how our brain works with a similar kind of self-organizing principle. And what I would offer is that I think the ideas we are coming together around are decent, are sensible, are essential to our survival and our thriving, this idea that we're all in this together and we need to come together in these values and these dreams. But I think we face a significant challenge, a threshold challenge, which is that the architecture of our connection, our sharing, our collective neurology is shifting into single platforms owned by particular corporations who have a monetary interest in what gets shared and how and what gets connected around. And so this is why Avaz, we grew tremendously over the years, but for the past few years, we've been focused all out on disinformation and social media reform, because honestly, the things that used to be meritocratic and go viral, people resonate with, are not so much anymore. And what we're finding is these algorithms are putting their finger on the scales in a massive way. That means that the beautiful vision of something like OneShared.World just might not go as viral as, and that's a profound problem for humanity, I think, in our developmental psychology, because it could have permanent path-dependent effects. And so I just want to make the pitch as an advocate. We all need to take this problem seriously because it's the ocean we swim in.
Great, thank you very much, John.
Well, just really to follow up on what Ricken was saying, I think one is the realization that there is tremendous power in the individual and tremendous power in the networking of individuals. And again, I look at our own example here at Rotary, right? It was 1.2 million individuals, not a government, not a multilateral institution, that said, we're going to take on this task of eradicating polio. And we're on the verge of, eradicating the second human disease in history. And so I think the first is the realization that it's not about governments at the end of the day. It's obviously part of the solution, but civil society, individuals, organizations, networked, working together with shared values, with a relatively some kind of centralized structure to give direction and strategic focus, and then sort of decentralized entropy with interconnectivity can move mountains. We've shown it in Rotary with polio, and I think as we begin to look at all these other issues that need to be addressed in the world, there is a formula here where the individual and civil society can make a huge, huge difference.
Thank you very much, John. And final words from Sam.
So we've taken this concept of networking individuals and committed to a cause, an idea, to the idea of networking organizations, civil society organizations around the world. And tens of thousands of nonprofits are now networked in platforms connected with each other through groups like Forest or Civicus that exist. And our challenge really is, as we invent new things, we always like to try new things, is to focus on the platforms themselves, strengthen these networks, strengthen these nodes that connect us. There's tremendous need for the capacity of platforms in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and other places. And to focus on where we connect and how we connect, not just on building something new and standing alone, but making that collective something much more powerful than it is today, because we have the attention of governments. We have the attention of the world, and we simply need to make it at a much larger scale than we've done so far.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to the three of you for your words of wisdom and for your generosity. I'm very sorry we did not have more time, but just for you to know, we are being followed by more than 220,000 people around the world. So we really think that this is creating a big impact. So thank you. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker. He's Pramod Bhasin, who will speak on global responsibility of business in an interdependent world. Pramod is the chairman of Clicks Capital and ICRIER, one of India's foremost economic research think tanks. Previously, he founded Green Pact, and he is considered the pioneer of the business process management industry. Pramod is one of India's most influential businesses and thinkers. Over to you, Pramod, and thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an honor and a huge privilege, and a subject that is very, very important and dear to my heart. The global responsibility of business in this interdependent world today has increased exponentially. The fact is, we have a lot of debates on shareholders versus stakeholder management and the impact businesses have not just on their employees and their shareholders, but across the world. I really believe the time for these debates is long gone. We live in an interdependent world, and we must acknowledge and recognize as business people the impact we have on many others who may not count amongst us shareholders and our stakeholders. There is no point us making an extra buck for our shareholders if that goes in them spending it to pay for the wastage and the environmental damage that we create at the same time. So we have to behave and understand what is a responsible business. How do we start laying the foundations of a new definition of how businesses are responsible and what they are truly, truly going to be responsible for in the future? This is hard to do. Shareholders, analysts, quarterly reports do not allow this to happen in any meaningful way, and yet CEOs of businesses have to drive this change. We cannot possibly acquiesce to this dysfunctional status quo that we have today at a time when our world seems to be splitting apart. That will come and bite every business back in a way that will be unexpected. Our pace of change is also very slow. You know all of this. despite the fires that are burning, the pandemics around us, and the inequality that continues to worsen in many critical countries, and the cost that is rising so enormously for all our businesses as we confront this very unequal and very new world. This crisis, though, must represent absolutely the best opportunity we possibly have. At ICRIER, at Economic Research, we aim to do a lot more work in the area of thinking about sustainability and how businesses can contribute to that far more effectively. There are a few ways in which we must promote action. I'll take a few examples. The first is clearly regulatory. You know, in India, we came up with a CSR contribution regulation, which every business protested against. It required us to put away 2% of our annual profits for using it for CSR purposes. And yet the fact is today, it is accepted, it is working, and it is widespread in its usage to achieve some amazingly wonderful targets and results. Two, if you think about the recent announcement by New Zealand that has announced regulations requiring banks, financial institutions, and major companies to report on climate risks and exposures. Unless we get the investing community to think much more thoughtfully, just like BlackRock has announced, to think much more thoughtfully about the companies they invest in and think about the impact those people have and the exposures they have to climate risk and influence them in that manner, we will remain, unfortunately, very, very isolated and siloed in our business world, pretending that the rest of the world doesn't impact us. The UK government has also come up with plans for pension funds to disclose their exposure to climate change, to think about how they are investing for the future and how they are investing in those companies that are really serious about this, because there is an enormous amount of lip service in the business world in these areas. Lastly, beyond regulation, I really believe we need a global rating system. The global rating system could be as a credit rating system or perhaps a building rating system. A global rating system for companies around sustainability, but very importantly, around products. Products which are rated based on the life cycle of the materials that are used, on how easily those are usable, how easily they are to recycle, how easily they can be sold, and how much value can be created from their material, which can be recycled subsequently. If we can create an economic model that really works for recyclable products by providing them these ratings, and the information is available, we have to put our minds to it. It sounds complex, but we must try and provide a rating for every product that we buy. I really believe consumers will vote with their feet and will force companies to think very differently about the products they produce and the impact those products can have on our entire environment. We must think big and bold. Ranking products and rating them will be fought by every major company. There will be 1,000 reasons not to do it, and really only a few reasons to say this is why we must do it. There is no point in rich companies producing products that have built-in obsolescence, that cannot be recycled, that are made in such a way that destroys the inherent value of the materials that are being used. There are many experiments that have been done in this area, and I really believe it is incumbent upon all of us to be able to take these on and make them mainstream, make them part of our lives. Just as we look at calories in a food product, we must look at the sustainability index of every product as we go forward. My belief is that employees, customers will in time vote with their feet. My generation, we did not have this luxury. We were not in a situation where we thought about these were the dangers of sustainability and interdependence as prominent in front of us as they are today. The key point I would leave you with is the incentives for how CEOs are paid must also change. Boards have to come out and ask CEOs to think very differently about how they drive profitability. While I hear the noise about stakeholder, and while I hear the noise about stakeholders and shareholders, I am very confident that we and CEOs and companies will find their way through this, just like they do many other problems and solutions, such as global supply chains that are falling apart, tariffs and barriers that are coming up artificially. Every company is able to find its way through. We must change the incentive. We have to play a role with regulation, much bolder, tougher regulation. And we must self-regulate across our products in a way that makes it much more transparent to the world. Thank you very much, and a pleasure. And I really hope businesses can embrace this change. We have no time left. We really have no time left. And we must understand that what we do is hurting us really badly for our future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pramod. Let's pop in here. Thank you so much, Pramod. That was really just an important message. What we're talking about now is how can we think differently about our self-interests? If we all think of our self-interest in the narrowest way possible, it may seem in the short term that we are advancing some kind of cause. But if everybody does that and the sum total of all of our actions is to break the world, break the biosphere in which we all live, we're all going to be harmed. And that's why we can't just change incentives, although we have to. We also have to change in many ways our consciousness. And that begins with our education. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce our really great next panel, although I must admit I'm slightly confused about if it's the education panel, which I hope it is. So I'm going to take a risk. And there we go. I see it now. And it's really my tremendous pleasure to welcome and introduce two people I have really great respect for. Mary Papazian, president of San Jose State University and a member of the OneShared.World Core Leadership Council, who has been with us since really day one. And Esther Brimmer, who many, many moons ago was my colleagues at the State Department, and now is just an incredible leader in the education world. So let me start by asking you, Mary, how can we think differently about the role of education in laying the foundation for the kind of world that we've articulated here and all want to build?
Well, as we've heard already, and thank you for this amazing summit, Jamie, and all the work folks have done. We've heard from so many, and I go back now to Professor Nye's comment about how we have to rethink what is really in our best interest. And that means rethinking the paradigm of how we approach problems in the world and how we approach relationships in the world. And nowhere is that, I think, more evident than in the educational experiences that our students have. This is where we grow. This is where we learn. This is where we learn how to integrate and to think about our place in the world. And so when I see the young generation at our university, we're right here in the heart of Silicon Valley. So it is a global center, and the problems of the world are really what our students want to address. And if we put those problems in the center and we ask our students to bring their life experiences and to think about the connections between each of them, whether they're here in our own locale or in a place across the world, we'll find those shared interests. And so by encouraging students to ask questions, to think about those things beyond themselves, to move from education as just a private good, something that creates opportunity for each of us individually in our own lives, to something that is also a public good, something that allows us to have an impact in shaping the world in which we want to live. And at the heart of that, it's education. It is not just starting at the university, of course. It starts early on with the way we bring young people together. and create the opportunities for them to address those things that they care most about.
Thank you so much, Mary. And Esther, we just heard this conversation about building a network of networks. You represent a league, a community of educators. So to realize this wonderful vision that Mary has articulated, how do we work with teachers and students alike to try to build this consciousness and educate people maybe just a little bit differently about our responsibilities to each other?
Well, first, Jamie, thank you so much for being for the opportunity to be part of the One Shared World conversation. It's been an inspiring morning just listening to all of the speakers that you've had today. So first, thank you for bringing us together and for connecting us and with all the people who are listening in around the world. And indeed, that education really is part of creating a new appreciation for our interdependence. Through the day, we've talked about climate, we've talked about health, but education is also about shaping how we approach the world. And so indeed, the type of work Mary has just described is absolutely fundamental to thinking about the role of global learning. So that means educating us together. It could mean literally having lots of different people from different countries studying together. That's the excitement and promise of international education. That may be in person, but in the era of the pandemic, that's also virtual. And so we see exciting activities where, for example, faculty members are working together in different countries on courses together for their students, because not every student can travel. That actually it's bringing global elements into the classroom is really an important part of what we're talking about. But that means we must grapple with access, making sure that more people from more backgrounds have access to international education. And we must address the digital divide. We are thankful for this amazing technology, but we have to make sure that more people have access to this technology in service of education and helping us understand together through studying together that we have one shared future.
Thank you so much. It's so essential. In the early days of One Shared World, we came together, people from all around the world, and drafted our common declaration of interdependence, which has now been translated into 19 languages. And part of that, we talked about not just the role of consciousness raising and education, but reaching out to people to include who may not have the same levels of access. And I'm really pleased and honored now to weave into our conversation one of my favorite people, Vishaka Desai, who is, if there's anybody who has thought and in many ways personified the themes of interdependence and cultural connectivity that we're talking about here, it's Vishaka Desai, who is a professor at Columbia and the former president of the Asian Society. Vishaka, we'd love to hear your thoughts about how we can think about the role of education in laying the foundation for this future that we'd all like to build.
Well, thank you, Jamie, and wonderful to see Esther and Mary again. Let me just say that, so far we've heard from amazing people about what the issue is. When it comes to education, it's really about what are we going to do about it and how we're going to do that. And I love the fact that we began with a beautiful poem, and that actually with a sentence that said that we are unbound to everyone. Poets, artists, sages have told us for a long time that the world is one. It goes back all the way to Vedic text that I often use, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the world is family. We heard from other artists as well. So we know that this exists, but it's been too abstract. And now what we have to deal with is how and what we're going to do about it. And that's where education becomes so very crucial. And so I'm sorry that I was a little late, but we are together here now, and I'm going to begin really with our conversation with Mary and with Esther, because these are two big education leaders in the space that actually they've thought a lot about how do we deal with this idea, on the one hand, of international, on the other hand, and together, interdependence. So Mary, I want to ask you the first question, and that is that as a president of a university, you've thought about international, we've had international studies. What is different about this interdependence that we need to inject into this conversation? And how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've talked a lot about international, which means being aware that the world is a big place and that our students, for example, will go abroad and they will study and they will live in different environments. But global and interdependence is really taking it a step further. It's not just understanding different places in the world, but it's understanding the relationship between and amongst them, and really seeing it in a relational way. It's getting students to think about what is shared, looking at problems that are not just unique to one particular place, the details there, the history there, but really looking at the connections and how what we do in one place, this is interdependence and the mutual responsibilities of it, and having students reflect on it. I'm just going to put a plug here if I can for just 1 minute. If folks go to the OneShared.World website and look at the Idea Schools toolkits, there are many guides there on hope, on interdependence, on climate change, on human rights, on social justice, you name the issues, that ask people in their local place to reflect and to ask questions and to have conversations that open up this question of relational shared experiences. And what happens is we find that there's more that binds us together than actually identifies our unique expression of what those common experiences might be.
Thank you. Esther, you had one of the largest organizations dealing with international educators, and you've been involved in this international education space for a long time. One of the issues, as Mary pointed out, is we actually have to take it to the next level. Somehow it doesn't seem enough that we brought students from different parts of the world and came together. That one of the challenges in our universities is that we're so focused on specificity of knowledge. Very important. But how do we actually get to the interdisciplinary, interplace-based kind of education? And where do you see as the biggest challenges? Because you've brought students from everywhere, you've worked with educators everywhere. So how do we actually crack that nut of specialization in addition that we have to add this cross-specialization?
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for the question and for the discussion. Indeed, we want to look at how we can see education as an approach to life. It is not only an aspect for the important qualifications for a particular specialty, but actually we, in a sense, need to redefine what it means to be well educated. And that means to have a global perspective on the world, to understand those issues that transcend borders and affect all of us as human beings. And indeed, so we want to see how we can bring the global learning elements into the classroom and into the assignments. And they're very practical things we can do. If I can, suggest some of the resources that we've looked at to help people as they're doing this, to help faculty in the classroom, to help administrators who are bringing people together. I identified earlier one of the greatest challenges being spanning the digital divide and access to international education. That's really a real interest of ours, is how we make sure we expand access. But some of the things we look at are finding those issues that span human existence. So one, of course, that is very much at the front of our thinking now is social justice. Mm-hmm. And indeed, NAFSA actually, literally this month, I've published the results of the 2-year work on social justice in international education to try to allow many voices who are the many different authors to talk about social justice and how that can inform our thinking about international education. To look at how we could, yes.
I was just going to say that, our time is going to be fairly short, but one thing that I think we all have to remind ourselves is that for so long, most of us who've been in this international relations or global education space, oftentimes it seems like its space is only open to people who are already privileged. Mm-hmm. And how to make sure that the voices that we need to hear with different perspectives are in this space, and education is one of those equalizers, but we must work at it as we go forward. So in the 1 minute we have, I want to just quickly ask each one of you to say, we have thousands of people listening to this program. Education is a system, but education is also what happens individually at home. What do we do? So there was one thing you want all of our listeners from around the world to say, this is one thing you can do differently from where you've been before. Mary?
Well, I would say that don't worry that you have to change the world. The world is changed by small acts. And those small acts and those acts of interdependence can happen within your own community. And it's asking yourself the question on anything you want to do, how does this impact someone else? And if you start with that question, it's amazing how you can bring in other people. It can start small, and many small changes have a way of adding up to something that can be very profound.
Thank you. Esther?
I would say seek out someone who has a different background or is from a different place than you and have a conversation. As you say, you start to change the world by talking to somebody else and really listening. I think that's where we can start.
So it takes another person, another family, another country to make this an our world, as our rap dancer and some musician told us. Thank you very, very much. It was brief, but I hope that all of you are listening can get something and say, please do your part. We all need to do our part. Education begins with ourselves, not somewhere else. So with that, thank you. And let me just say that I have now a pleasure of introducing the new segment, which is a very short, powerful video on the urgency of interdependence. In the video, we will hear from Hadi, a Syrian refugee in Turkey, working with Me, We, Syria on communications and community building programs. Thank you very much. You know there is a breakout session later, so the education conversation can continue. Thanks.
So it's just a small correction from what Vishaka said. We do have that incredible video, and we're going to post it on social media. So thank you very much. We have this is a global production, and sometimes we have to do a little bit of jazz. And we are all performing this jazz together. So welcome to all of you. I really value what was just said in that last conversation, because what we were talking about is changing consciousness. And it doesn't happen on the macro level. It's 1 + 1 + 1 equals 7.7 billion people. And that's why it's my incredible pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Albie Sachs, who is a legendary South African jurist who played a leading role among many other heroes in the fight against apartheid. Because if this change were easy, as everybody has said, if you could just snap your fingers and everybody would immediately become better off and get it, we would have recognized our mutual responsibilities of our interdependence right away. It's hard. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of effort. And so I'd love to introduce, and then I'm going to drop off and get out of the way, Albie Sachs and my dear friend Paula Raymond, who's a member of the OneShared.World Core Leadership Council and another legendary champion of using the tools of nonviolent social action to change minds and hearts. So Paula, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. And I am sincerely honored to be here on OneShared World today with both Brona Hines and Albie Sachs. After hearing so much of what has already happened today on this amazing transnational effort to create a sense of interdependency, we couldn't be more blessed today than having Albie Sachs and Brona Hines with us. Because for each of you that are in the audience right now and have been listening to this, from our Native American beginning to hearing about power with rather than power over, from hearing from people from refugee camps and the calls from academia and the halls of science, that we are beyond the time for nation states not to join with each other in an interdependent way. And something that Albie and Brona have taught us from their own life experience is the importance of crossing boundaries with moral leadership and moral courage. And I ask each of you, as we hear from Brona and Albie today, to think about your own moral courage and what you need to do, what small steps you can take to help create a new ethos for humanity on behalf of yourself, on behalf of your family, on behalf of your community, on behalf of your own nation, but most importantly, on behalf of humanity. And with that, I want to start our discussion today with Albie and Brona with the question. From each of your own life experiences of courage and leadership that you have shown, Albie in South Africa, Brona in Northern Ireland, and both of you as transnational ambassadors for the movement of peace and justice. What is the greatest obstacle that we face in creating our vision, our common vision for a one shared world that we can share with our great audience today? Can you start, Albie?
Oh, so Albie, for some reason, we're not able to hear you. So
we'll start with Brona, and then we'll catch out. Brona, the same question, my dear friend, as a leader of the peace marches by the mothers in Northern Ireland, to the founder of Being Democracy, and for your work with the Syrian refugees. And most importantly, to make sure that women have a voice at all the tables for peace and justice. Brona, if you could just start us off with what you see as the most important obstacle we can overcome to create one shared world.
So, Brona, unfortunately, we're not able to hear you. And Albie, are you back yet?
Let's try. Let me speak. Can you hear me now?
Awesome. All right.
There you go, Albie. Welcome, brother. Welcome.
Yeah, Bill, this revolution is
interdependent. We're hearing each other.
Yes.
And I'm going to deflect your question a little bit by actually introducing two themes into the conversation.
Please.
Both very South Africa related. And the first is to speak about what has been described as the biggest international civil society, if you like, interdependent movement since the anti-slavery abolitionist movement, and that's the anti-apartheid movement. It was set up in tiny offices in London and in Dar es Salaam, and it grew into a huge movement. And I'm thinking about what special qualities did it have. And one was that it had a very clear theme. It's not enough just to be interdependent. It's not enough just to be dissatisfied with egotism and selfishness. There needs to be a kind of concrete goal around which people can mobilize and organize. And the other is it needs a good balance between clear focus, a sense of discipline and structure, and the largest possible amount of spontaneity, local initiative, individual initiative. So we never had a grand international anti-apartheid movement. We had a vast movement that had centers all over the world, in the trade union movement, in faith communities, in individuals, different artist groups were all involved. And I think that could be quite a useful road to follow in crystallizing this interdependence movement without making it too crystallized, getting some structure and organization, but not ossifying it and not making it too controlled. And I would urge people who are interested in following this Connie Field in California, in the United States, made 7 wonderful films about the anti-apartheid movement, showing its enormous diversity. The other theme is Ubuntu, a philosophical value that wasn't part of our liberation struggle, of our revolutionary movement in the hard political sense, but became exceptionally important in the post-liberation field to establish connections between people, between the past and the future. It's an African term that highlights interdependence. It gets away from the idea of human beings being in competition with other human beings. It sees our autonomy being enhanced and made much richer and stronger through respecting the humanity and the autonomy of others. And it's very powerful in our society. And it's enabling our people to survive all sorts of terrible afflictions and helping us to get through the COVID-19 issues.
Albie, I just want to give Brona a chance, but I just want to extend to you thankfulness for all the work you've done under the rubric of Ubuntu, that my dignity rests on yours. And that is exactly the kind of ethos that we need to be able to bring to realization all of the conversations that have gone before this, is how do we do that? Brona, I hope you're on now and you can continue the conversation in the spirit that Albie just laid out of how do we create the sensibility of our dignity being resting on each other. Brona? I think she's still not there.
So here is what I'm going to offer. Brona's voice is so important, and it's so essential because what we're talking about is how individual people can't just change their own consciousness, but can change the consciousness of a nation and a world. And that's exactly what people like Brona and Albie have done. And as I was saying before, the moral courage to drive change is what we need on every level. And it's hard. If this was easy, we would have already done it. And so again, with that, our mission in this summit today isn't to answer every question. It's to begin a conversation that we can all be part of. The numbers are in, but I think we're nearing 1 million people around the world who are in one way or another participating in this conversation. And this conversation is in many ways like a virus. It's a virus of hope and change, and inspirational leaders like Paula and Albie and Brona are our guides. And they are guides from a generation that is now connecting with the younger generation, people like Kekeshan Basu and the young coordinators who we met in the morning. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the video that we referenced just a short while ago from a really special person, and you'll hear from him right now.
My name is Hadi. I am from Syria. Interdependence for me is the feeling and being responsible of the global issues in the world. It means acting with a connection with other people's concerns. As a Syrian, I see the opportunity to practice interdependence between Syrian refugees and the hosting communities, especially now in the pandemic of COVID-19, because it's an opportunity to practice how we depend on each other, how we gather resources to help each other, despite our nationalities and despite our different capacities. So people may go back to the narrow belonging when they are in a state of danger, and this can be normal. But despite the war in Syria, Syrian refugees have proven that they are able to collaborate with other people and other communities. However, for the better future of Syria, Syrians inside Syria and outside Syria, all different sectors, should collaborate and depend on each other. Because if these all experiences the Syrians have, the diaspora of Syrians will be opportunities for growth. Finally, I believe that our survival, progress, and development as a humanity depend on our communication and on our interdependence. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Annie Forsheimer, and I was a U.S. diplomat for 30 years, serving all over the world. I'm now coordinating OneShared.World's effort to get the leaders of the Group of 20, the G20, to commit to what Jamie refers to as a new global operating system. In other words, in a very specific way, they should commit to a plan to ensure safe access to drinking water, basic sanitation and hygiene, and essential pandemic preparedness, or what we are calling WASH-PAP, to all people by 2030. It's consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, but what's different is that it's urgent. Our panel will help us understand the urgency of this request and give ideas about what all of us can do. We're joined by Jack Sim, the founder and CEO of the World Toilet Foundation, which promotes health, dignity, and well-being for all through sustainable sanitation. He's in Singapore where it's very late at night. And we're joined by Saran Kaba-Jones, founder and CEO of FACE Africa, working to bring clean water, sanitation, and hygiene programs to remote communities in sub-Saharan Africa. We have a short time for a big topic. I would like both of you, please, first of all, welcome, and I would like both of you, please, to tell me, how would fixing the water, sanitation, and hygiene sector, how is it vital to solving the COVID-19 problems and preventing future pandemics? Saran, would you please start?
Thanks, Annie. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is a very important topic because the COVID-19 crisis has highlighted the urgency and the need to address water, sanitation, and hygiene issues around the world. Because now more than ever, access to safe water, sanitation, and hygiene is critical to our global community, as we're seeing in light of the coronavirus outbreak. We've seen that one of the most important contributions we can make to slow down transmission of COVID-19 and keep ourselves and our community safe is to wash and sanitize our hands. This was also the case during the 2014 Ebola crisis in West Africa, where my organization, FACE Africa, was actively working to stop the spread of the disease in Liberia through community-based education and distribution of water filters and hygiene kits. Through those efforts, we were able to save tens of thousands of lives through these community-based responses. And we found that promoting good hand hygiene helped control the spread of the disease. And given recent events, I think improved hygiene has never been more important and more critical. And by focusing efforts on water, sanitation, and hygiene on that sector as a whole, we can help to solve not just COVID-19, but also future pandemics.
Thank you so much. And Jack, how would you answer the same question?
So I founded the World Toilet Organization in 2001. That's because that at that time, the subject of going to the toilet, shit, poop, pee were considered taboo subject. And 2.6 billion people don't have access to proper sanitation. This caused all kinds of problems. When you don't have toilet, you defecate near the river and the water become contaminated, and diarrhea kills 1.8 million people per year. And that is even more than the current COVID-19. COVID-19 has now heightened the awareness of hand washing and hygiene to a level never before experienced in mankind history. And we hope that hereafter people will not stop washing their hands even after COVID is over, because after SARS in 2003 were over, they stopped washing their hands. And I think we have to always prepare for the next disease X, pandemic X that will happen, because these kind of diseases, they mutate. So the World Toilet Organization took sanitation and decoupled it from the water agenda so that people can talk about it. We use humor by calling ourselves the WTO, that sounds like the World Trade Organization, and the world media love it, calling us the other WTO, and suddenly sanitation took center stage. After 13 years of hard work, our founding day, 19th of November, is enshrined unanimously by 193 country members of the UN General Assembly as the official UN World Toilet Day. So in 2 months' time, you will celebrate World Toilet Day, 19th of November, because every year we make policy changes and we solve this problem. When people don't have toilet, when girls go out to the bush, they get raped or molested, and also peeping toms that reduces their privacy. When people don't have toilets, the flies spread the disease from the poop and go to the food, and children die. So sanitation is so important, and we have been working for the last 20 years since 2001, and we will continue serving everyone such that one day all people will have access to a proper clean toilet anytime and anywhere they go, not just at home, but at workplace, at transport center, at prayer center, recreational center, and everywhere you need to go, you need to go.
Jack, thank you. And thank you for addressing the taboos that can be associated with this topic. Saran, I wonder if you could answer the question that we all want to know through interdependence. What can an individual do to be of service in this solving this terribly big problem? And with respect to our call on the G20 leaders, how can citizens of the world make their leaders see what others have talked about, that self-interest can be more widely defined?
That's a great question, Annie. I think when we think about issues like water, access to water and toilets, we usually think of it in terms of it being a government provided service. We think of it as a government issue, something that the government needs to be tackling, when in fact, individuals and citizens themselves can take ownership of these issues. We have just 10 years to go to deliver on the global goals. And we can only do this by mobilizing not only government, but calling on people, calling on individuals, calling on ourselves to take ownership of some of these issues. The UN is calling this decade the decade of action. And I think partnerships and corporations is key in helping to solve some of these issues. And my wish is that during this decade of action, in order to accomplish the goal 6, which is ensuring access to water and sanitation for all, we must make use of goal 17, which is partnerships for the goals. That means partnering with civil society organizations, partnering with corporations and businesses, holding governments accountable to prioritize access to clean water and sanitation and hygiene. Like Jack said earlier, the issue of sanitation affects not only our health, but also the ability for girls to attend school. It's a safety issue, it's a health issue, it's an economic issue. And I think if we look at it from an economic standpoint, and how, for example, in a lot of African countries, a lot of African economies, the GDP of an entire country is affected by how much access to clean water and sanitation they have. So we have to look at it in terms of an economic issue, a health issue, an education issue, and just a cross-section of challenges that just solving this one problem can address.
Thank you. I really appreciate how complex the issue is, and it can be, it can be about a network of people trying to solve the problem because it affects a network. And Jack, I wonder if you could, kind of delve a little bit more about some of the obstacles to solving this problem that aren't about money, that's really about the political will to do it or the cultural taboos that you talked about.
Yes, I think that when we say we hold the government accountable, it's a little bit threatening for them. But actually, there's a lot of incentive that they can draw upon by building toilet, because toilet is the cheapest medicine in the world. It's a preventive medicine. When you have proper hygiene and sanitation, then you save a huge chunk of money on your healthcare costs. So we have to approach sanitation as a whole of government calculation of budget. If you save the medical bills, people have toilet, are hygienic, they will earn money. And then they will be able to pay taxes, generate jobs, create economic activities. So a toilet prevents people from being sick, but also make them productive. Another one is that if we drive demand for sanitation and we make poop culture, pop culture, make music, make songs, make painting, make sculptures, talk about it, have fun, comics, what will happen is that the people realize that toilet is important. And when the politician realize that they can win election by promising people toilet, then boom, you will have a lot of toilets built. Prime Minister Modi has built 110 million toilet last year. And this is because he realized that toilet is a vote winner. In Africa, in everywhere you can do it. In China, President Xi Jinping is also a toilet champion. So I
can't top that, but I will say that we may be out of our section's time. I really appreciate your words of wisdom and your energy and your commitment. And I think we all agree that the G20 leaders have to listen to this message, because we are about preventing the next pandemic, and we are about the interdependence of all of these issues and all of our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie.
Hello, everyone. I am Jacqueline Davis, and I'm one of the co-chairs of Arts and Culture for OneShared.World. It is my great pleasure to welcome the world-famous singer, activist, and humanist who has graced the opera stages across the world, Renee Fleming. She joins us with her reflections on what it means to live in an interdependent world, and as a special treat, she will sing for us Amazing Grace. And now, Renee Fleming.
Thank you, Jackie, and Jamie Metzel for inviting me to be part of this event. I'm so encouraged to see this summit and to join in at a time when people all over the world have a new awareness of how urgently we need unity to conquer some enormous challenges. The power of the arts to connect people is something I hope we all recognize. As a musician, I often feel like I'm speaking the oldest, most universal language there is. Since our ancestors carved the first bone flute about 40,000 years ago, human creativity and community have been expressed and strengthened through music. In virtually every culture, people celebrate their most joyous events and comfort each other in moments of darkest tragedy by sharing songs, hymns, or chants. Artistic exchange has been a key way to find common ground in some of the most divided times in history, including the fall of the Iron Curtain. A current example is the Polyphony Foundation, which brings together Arab and Israeli youth to make music as a way of forging concord in that region. With the COVID-19 pandemic halting live concerts as well as most of the gatherings where we share music, It's amazing to see the continued flow of creativity in the digital space. And until we can be together again in person, people are finding community in a totally new way through virtual concerts and interactions, online masterclasses, live stream theater, and symposiums like this one. So as we pass through this troubled period, I'm here to say that there are literally millions of artists around the world, not just musicians, but artists of every kind, ready and waiting to answer this call and to make music and art that reaches across barriers of language, geography, and nationality. It's what we do. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. 'Twas blind that now I see. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead me home, and grace will lead us home.
It's hard to speak after such a perfect expression of why we're all here and what we're striving for. Even in this dark moment, there is so much hope. The hope that we can hear in Renee's beautiful music and in all of the words that we've heard all day, recognizing, demonstrating how we can come together to solve our greatest common problems. As Albie and Brona and others have shown through their words and through their experience, this isn't going to be easy. As a matter of fact, when people talk about a group of regular citizens coming together to try to upgrade the operating system of the world, some call it crazy, some call it audacious, but it's essential. Because if we continue with the status quo, we know where that future heads. But there's a much better future that's awaiting all of us if we have the courage to build it. Today is an action forum. So it's partly about words. It's partly about consciousness and education, but it's ultimately about action. It's about what we can each and all do to drive change on the smallest individual level and on the largest systemic level. We hope that you've heard our call to reach out to your leaders and the G20 leaders about ensuring that every human being on Earth has access to safe water, basic sanitation, and hygiene by 2030. To reach out to your institutions to make sure that the mission statements and platforms of every political party, every government, every company, every civil society organization explicitly recognizes the mutual responsibilities of our interdependence. We want everybody to join this movement. Of course, we would love for you to go to the OneShared.World website and sign the Pledge of Interdependence. We'd love for you to translate the Declaration of Interdependence into your language, to recruit others to join this movement, which isn't just about our organization. It's about all of us coming together in a network of networks to drive change. Some special thank yous to so many people who have made today possible. Our incredible sponsors and partners, thank you. And if we could show the slide of who they are, just really amazing, amazing organization. We had 300,000 people participating in this conversation, and it's thanks to this network. And we have millions of impressions on social media, and this is just the beginning. We also have an unbelievably incredible team of OneShared.World, people, all volunteers who have been working day and night for months to put this together. I wish I could mention everybody's name. Actually, I could sing their praises. Actually, I would ask Renee to sing their praises. So thank you so much, the OneShared.World team.